There was once a shepherd boy who learned the quiet ways of God before he ever learned the weight of a crown. There was once a king who sang in the night, fought in the daylight, fell in sorrow, rose in repentance, and spent his life leaning, again and again, toward the mercy of the Lord. This is the Shepherd's Bible. Let the world grow quiet around you. Let the day loosen its grip, and let your breathing slow. The hills around Bethlehem lie quiet under evening blue. The sheep gather close, warm and breathing. A young shepherd sits with a harp in his hands, the strings low and gentle. Far above him, the stars are bright and patient. No crowd knows his name. No court calls for him. No army waits on his courage, but heaven sees him. That hidden beginning matters. We will walk this story faithfully, honoring the courage, not hiding the sin, lingering over the mercy, and listening through it all for the quiet music that runs beneath everything, the faithfulness of the Lord. Let the words become a low lamp. Let the ancient roads grow soft beneath your thoughts. So many of God's works begin away from applause. A boy is keeping sheep. A prophet is grieving. A horn of oil is waiting. A kingdom is about to turn, though most of Israel does not yet know it. Tonight, we begin there, not with a throne, but with the sorrow that comes before a new beginning. Saul was still king in Israel, but the kingdom had grown troubled under his hand. The prophet Samuel, who had once poured oil upon Saul's head and watched the people rejoice, now carried a heavy grief. He had seen the cost of disobedience. He had heard the word of the Lord concerning Saul. The first king of Israel had been given much, yet he had not remained faithful in the way the Lord required. Samuel mourned him. It is a tender thing and a painful thing to mourn someone who is still alive. Samuel mourned not only the man Saul had become, but also the hope that had once been placed upon him. He mourned the beauty of beginnings that did not remain steady. He mourned the sadness of gifts misused, of calling not fully honored, of a heart that had grown hard where it should have remained humble. But the Lord, who is never confused and never without purpose, spoke into Samuel's grief. How long? The Lord asked him. Would he go on mourning for Saul, since the Lord had rejected him from reigning over Israel? Samuel was told to fill his horn with oil and go. The Lord would send him to Bethlehem, to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for there, among Jesse's sons, the Lord had provided for himself a king. Samuel heard the command, but he also knew the danger of it. Saul was still upon the throne. The kingdom had not yet changed hands. If Saul heard that Samuel was traveling to anoint another, what then? The old prophet spoke plainly. He was afraid that Saul would hear of it and kill him. The Lord answered with wisdom suited to the hour. Samuel was to take a heifer with him and say that he had come to sacrifice to the Lord. He was to invite Jesse to the sacrifice. Then, at the appointed time, the Lord would show him what to do and which son was to be anointed. So Samuel came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him trembling. A prophet's arrival was not a small thing. Men searched their own hearts when Samuel appeared. They wondered whether judgment had come, or some grievous matter. Samuel told them to come in peace. He had come to sacrifice to the Lord. He sanctified Jesse and his sons, and invited them to the offering. One can imagine the little town breathing in quiet expectation. Bethlehem was not a proud city by the standards of kingdoms. It was a place of households and fields, of ordinary days, of sheep moving over nearby hills, of bread rising in ovens, familiar paths worn down by the feet of families who had lived there for generations. But God does not need a great city to begin a great work. He often chooses places that seem small to those who measure by outward grandeur, because he delights to show that his purposes do not depend on human display. When Jesse's sons came before Samuel, the prophet looked first at Eliab. The eldest, Eliab, had the appearance of strength. He seemed, at a glance, like the sort of man a nation might easily imagine as king. Samuel looked upon him and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." But the Lord answered Samuel with a word that would echo through the generations. "Do not look on his face, or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." How quietly that sentence enters the story, and how deeply it reaches. Human eyes are often dazzled by height, by symmetry, by confidence, by the visible signs of power. We are quick to trust what looks kingly, what sounds convincing, what wears dignity easily upon the shoulders. But the Lord sees more deeply than shoulders and voice and bearing. He sees motives, loves, loyalties, fears, hidden habits, secret prayers, unspoken pride, unguarded humility. He sees the inward place from which a life truly rises. So Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. But the Lord had not chosen him. Then came Shammah. The Lord had not chosen him either. One by one, the sons of Jesse passed before the prophet, and one by one the answer remained the same. These were sons of the household, men of the family, men with names and strength and presence, yet none of these were the one the Lord had chosen. Samuel asked Jesse whether these were all his children. Jesse answered that there remained yet the youngest, and behold, he was keeping the sheep. There, in that simple line, the story opens toward David. He was not standing near the sacrifice. He was not among those first presented. He was out in the fields with the sheep. A quiet fitness lives in that. Long before David would bear the burdens of a kingdom, he learned to watch over smaller lives in lonely places. He learned vigilance under the wide sky. He learned patience while the hills stretched out in silence. He learned the night watches, the sounds of wind through grass, the difference between ordinary stillness and the movement that means danger. He learned how to guide, how to defend, how to be alone without being empty. The sheep did not know they were helping prepare a king. The fields themselves could not have known. But God knew. Samuel said that they were not to sit down until the youngest had been brought. So they sent for him. When David came in, he was ruddy, with bright eyes, and pleasant in appearance. Youth was still upon him. He did not yet carry the weight of public history. The dust of the fields would have been familiar upon him. The scent of sheep and grass and open country would have clung to his clothing. And the Lord said, "Rise, anoint him, for this is he." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. Quiet and mighty at once. This moment, oil flowed. A father watched. Brothers stood near. A prophet obeyed. And a young shepherd, not yet seated upon any throne, not yet acclaimed by any crowd, was marked by the choosing of God. From that day forward, the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David. He returned, after the anointing, not at once to a palace, but to the familiar work of the field. The detail matters. God's call does not always change a man's visible setting on the same day that it changes his inward future. David was anointed, yes, but he still kept sheep. He still walked the same hills. He still passed the same stones and streams and thorny places. The great turning had come, but it remained hidden for a time beneath ordinary duties. Many of God's works begin that way. A life is changed before the world notices. A promise is spoken before the city hears of it. The oil is poured, and then the person returns to the quiet road for a while. Meanwhile, in Saul's house, another movement was taking place. The Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and a troubling spirit tormented him. The king's inner life had become restless and darkened. He who once stood tall before the people now lived with inward turbulence. His servants, seeing his distress, sought some way to soothe him. They spoke of a man skillful in playing the harp, a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, a man who was prudent in speech, mighty in valor, handsome in form, and most importantly, a man with whom the Lord was. So Saul sent messengers to Jesse and asked that David be sent to him. Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat, and sent them by David to Saul. The shepherd came into the troubled house of the king. Here the story moves with a holy irony. The future king entered the service of the present king. The one who had been chosen in secret came not with armies, not with rebellion, not with a banner of self-assertion, but with an instrument in his hands and obedience in his heart. David stood before Saul, and Saul loved him greatly, and made him his armor-bearer. When the troubling spirit came upon Saul, David took the harp and played with his hand. Music filled the chamber. The king was refreshed. The darkness lifted for a time. Something deeply human lives in this scene. Before David fought giants, before he commanded armies, before he wore a crown, he ministered with music. He served in a room heavy with sorrow. He did not yet take a throne. He offered relief. The hand that would one day wield a sword for Israel first moved across strings in the presence of another man's distress. Perhaps this is one reason David would later speak to God in songs that have outlived kingdoms. He knew already that music can enter places words alone do not reach. He knew the hush that follows melody. He knew how a heart can be calmed, not by argument, but by something gentler, something that moves through grief without denying it. So David moved between two worlds. There were times in Saul's service, and there were times again among the sheep. The court and the pasture both knew his footsteps. The king's chamber knew the sound of his harp. The hills knew the sound of his singing beneath the stars. Then the great testing of his early life arrived. The Philistines gathered their armies for battle against Israel. Camps were set. Lines were drawn. The valley lay between them. On one side stood the forces of Saul and Israel. On the other stood the Philistines. And from the Philistine camp came forth a champion, Goliath of Gath. He was a man of great size and terrible reputation. His armor shone with the weight of war. Bronze covered him. His spear was heavy like a weaver's beam. A shield-bearer walked before him. Day after day, he stepped forward and challenged the ranks of Israel. He cried out that they should choose a man to come down and fight him. If that man prevailed, the Philistines would serve Israel. If Goliath prevailed, Israel would serve the Philistines. But it was not only his strength that troubled the camp. It was the mockery. It was the steady humiliation. It was the voice of a giant calling the people of God to fear. For 40 days, morning and evening, Goliath presented himself. The men of Israel heard and were afraid. Saul himself, though king, did not go down. The army stood in a kind of wounded stillness, seeing the enemy, hearing his words, yet finding no one ready to answer. Back in Bethlehem, the rhythms of home continued. Jesse's 3 eldest sons had followed Saul to the battle, but David, the youngest, still moved back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. One day Jesse asked David to take roasted grain and 10 loaves to his brothers, and 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000, and to see how his brothers were doing. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, took what Jesse had prepared, and went as he had been commanded. Again, the story lets us see the beauty of simple obedience. David did not know, as he set out, that the path would lead to one of the great public moments of his life. He was carrying bread and grain and cheese. He was bringing provision, bringing news home, doing what a son had been told to do. Great turning points sometimes begin under the appearance of ordinary errands. He came to the place of battle as the army was going out to the fight and shouting for the battle. The lines were drawn, Israel on one side and the Philistines on the other. David left the things he carried with the keeper of the baggage, ran to the army, and came to greet his brothers. As he spoke with them, the champion came up again. Goliath of Gath stepped forward from the armies of the Philistines and spoke the same defiant words. This time, David heard them. The men of Israel, seeing the giant, fled from him and were greatly afraid. They spoke of the reward Saul had promised, great riches, the king's daughter in marriage, and freedom for his father's house in Israel. But their words still carried the tone of men speaking about something no one truly intended to do. David asked the men standing by what would be done for the man who killed this Philistine and took away the reproach from Israel. Then he asked the question at the center of his courage: who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? It is important to notice what David sees. The others see a giant. David sees a man standing against the living God. The others see an impossible opponent. David sees dishonor being thrown at the Lord's people. The others measure with fear. David measures with faith. His eldest brother Eliab heard him speaking and was angry. Why had David come down? With whom had he left those few sheep in the wilderness? Eliab accused him of pride and of coming down merely to see the battle. David answered gently and almost sadly. What had he done now? Was there not a cause? Then he turned from one person to another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him as before. At last the words reached Saul, and David was brought before the king. David said that no one's heart should fail because of the Philistine. He, David, would go and fight with him. Saul looked at the young man before him and answered according to visible logic. David was but a youth, while Goliath had been a man of war from his youth. But David spoke of the hidden schooling of the wilderness. When he kept his father's sheep, there had come a lion, and at another time a bear, and each had taken a lamb from the flock. David had gone after them, struck them, and delivered the lamb from their mouth. If they rose against him, he seized them by the beard and struck them down. The Lord, David said, who delivered him out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, would deliver him out of the hand of this Philistine. Notice the path of his faith. He does not begin with himself. He begins with what the Lord has already done. The shepherd remembers old deliverances. He remembers that the hand of God was with him when no army saw it, when no singer commemorated it, when no crowd applauded. The wilderness had trained him in secret trust. The lion and the bear had not been public victories, yet they had become part of the foundation for this hour. Saul, seeing the steadiness in David's words, said at last that he should go and that the Lord would be with him. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David girded Saul's sword on his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested these things. But he could not go in them. They were not his way. So he said that he could not fight like this, for he had not proved them. He put them off. Wisdom lives in that quiet refusal. David did not try to become another man for the sake of appearance. He did not dress himself in borrowed confidence. He did not take up what seemed impressive merely because others trusted it. He came as the Lord had already shaped him. He took his staff in his hand. He chose 5 smooth stones out of the brook and put them in the shepherd's bag he had. His sling was in his hand. Then he drew near to the Philistine. The image is unforgettable. A giant in armor, a shepherd with stones, bronze and iron on one side, leather, wood, and trust on the other. The Philistine came on and drew near to David, and when he looked and saw him, he disdained him. David was young, and not the kind of opponent he expected. Goliath cursed David by his gods, and asked whether he was a dog that David came with staffs. Then he called David near, threatening to give his flesh to the birds of the sky and the animals of the field. David answered with one of the great confessions of holy courage in all Scripture. "You come to me," he said, "with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and all this assembly will know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. The battle is the Lord's." That is not the speech of bravado. It is not the voice of a young man, intoxicated with his own daring. It is the voice of someone who knows that outward weakness does not trouble God, and that outward strength does not impress him. David's confidence rests not in accuracy of aim alone, nor in youthful boldness, but in the name of the Lord. When the Philistine arose and came near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the army to meet him. He put his hand in his bag, took from there a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank in, and Goliath fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with sling and stone. The great boaster fell. The long dread of Israel broke. The valley that had listened to 40 days of mockery now heard the turning silence that follows judgment. David had no sword in his hand when he first struck the giant down. The victory came through what seemed small, and because it came that way, no one could honestly say afterward that it had been merely a contest of earthly might. The Lord had answered through the servant who trusted him. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. The men of Israel and Judah rose up with a shout and pursued them. What had seemed impossible only moments before became a wide turning of the battle. Fear had switched camps. Meanwhile, Saul asked Abner whose son the youth was. Abner did not know. So David was brought before Saul with the head of the Philistine still in his hand, and Saul asked him whose son he was. David answered simply, "The son of Jesse the Bethlehemite." The king had known David as harp player and armor-bearer. Now he knew him more fully as the young man through whom the Lord had broken the fear of Israel. And another heart, standing near, was moved deeply that day. When David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. This friendship is one of the gentlest and strongest gifts in David's life. Jonathan was Saul's son, a prince, the one who by ordinary human order might have expected the kingdom to flow through him. Yet Jonathan was not moved by jealousy. He saw in David something noble, something true, something given by God, and he loved him. Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. He stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. It was a beautiful act. A prince honored the shepherd. A strong man recognized another strong man, not in rivalry, but in love. In a story that will later hold treachery, suspicion, betrayal, and violence, this friendship stands like clear water in the midst of rough country. David went out wherever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely. That phrase, behaved himself wisely, belongs to him in these early years. He was brave, yes, but not reckless. He was successful, yet not swollen with self-importance. He knew how to act with understanding. Saul set him over the men of war, and this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. For a brief moment, the story seems to open toward peace. The king is pleased. The people rejoice. Jonathan loves David. The Lord is with him. But human hearts are delicate things when pride goes unguarded. As the people returned from battle, the women came out from all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with instruments of music. They answered one another in song, saying that Saul had slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. The song was not wise for Saul to hear. He was very angry. The saying displeased him. They have ascribed, he thought, 10,000s to David, and only thousands to me. What more can he have but the kingdom? From that day forward, Saul eyed David. It is a small line with a long shadow. The eye that once looked with favor began to look with suspicion. The king, who had been soothed by David's harp, now began to feel threatened by David's success. The inward unrest in Saul found a new target. Praise that could have been received with gratitude became fuel for envy. Envy rarely announces itself as envy. It often dresses itself in concern, in wounded dignity, in the language of fairness. But once it settles in the heart, it changes how a person sees everything. David's faithfulness would now appear dangerous to Saul. David's success would sound like accusation. David's presence would feel like a threat, even when he meant no harm. The next day the troubling spirit came on Saul, and he raved within his house while David played with his hand, as he did day by day. Saul had a spear in his hand, and Saul cast the spear, for he said, "I will pin David to the wall." But David avoided him twice. The chamber of music became a chamber of danger. The hand that had brought relief was met with violence. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him and had departed from Saul. So he removed him from his presence and made him a captain over 1,000. David went out and came in before the people, and in all his ways he behaved himself wisely, and the Lord was with him. That only deepened Saul's fear. All Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. The more faithfully David lived, the more unstable Saul became in his regard toward him. Thus, the road narrowed. The shepherd had become a deliverer in the sight of the nation. The deliverer had become beloved by the people. The beloved servant had become feared by the king. And the life that had begun in quiet pasture was now moving toward years of testing beneath the open hand of God. Saul's fear did not remain a passing mood. It settled. It sharpened. It became the lens through which he looked at David again and again. At first, Jonathan was able to speak for his friend. Saul spoke to Jonathan and to his servants about killing David, but Jonathan delighted greatly in him and warned him to hide. Then Jonathan stood beside his father and spoke well of David. He reminded Saul that David had not sinned against him, that his works had been very good toward the king, that he had put his life in his hand and struck the Philistine, and that the Lord had worked a great deliverance for all Israel through him. Why, Jonathan asked, should Saul sin against innocent blood and kill David without cause? For a moment, Saul listened. He swore that David would not be put to death, and Jonathan brought David again into Saul's presence. There was a brief return, as though the old peace might yet be mended. But the broken place in Saul's heart had not been healed. War rose again. David went out and fought the Philistines and struck them with a great slaughter, so that they fled before him. Then, when he returned, the troubling spirit came again upon Saul. David was in the house, playing music with his hand, and Saul had his spear. The king hurled it, seeking to pin David to the wall. Again, David escaped. That night, the danger became impossible to deny. Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him and kill him in the morning. But Michal, Saul's daughter, David's wife, loved him and warned him. If he did not save his life that night, she said, tomorrow he would be killed. So she let him down through the window. David fled under cover of darkness. The house behind him was the house of his wife, and yet it was also the reach of his enemy. What should have been a place of rest had become a place watched by death. Michal, to delay the messengers, placed an image in the bed and covered it to look like a sleeping body. By the time the deception was uncovered, David had gone. He fled to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done. Then he and Samuel went and stayed at Naioth. Even there, the strange conflict between Saul's rage and God's sovereignty showed itself. Saul sent messengers to seize David, but when they came into the company of prophets and saw Samuel standing over them, the Spirit of God came upon them, and they prophesied instead. Saul sent others, and the same thing happened. A third time it happened again. At last Saul himself went, and before he reached the place, the Spirit of God came upon him also. He prophesied and lay stripped down, humbled in a way he neither planned nor welcomed. It was as though heaven itself was reminding everyone that Saul, for all his royal power, was not master of the hour. Yet David could not remain sheltered there forever. He fled from Naioth and came to Jonathan. The question he carried was not only practical, but wounded. What had he done? What was his iniquity? What sin had he committed before Saul that the king sought his life so relentlessly? Jonathan at first struggled to believe the danger had reached its full measure, but David answered with sorrow and certainty. There was but a step between him and death. Together they made a plan around the feast of the new moon. David would hide in the field, and Jonathan would watch Saul's response at the king's table. If Saul was calm, there would be peace. If Saul's anger burned, then Jonathan would know that his father was determined to do evil. Jonathan pledged himself fully to David. Their covenant deepened in the shadow of danger. Jonathan asked that, when David came into the kingdom God had promised him, he would show covenant kindness to Jonathan's house and not cut off his love forever. David swore it. Then came the meal, the missing place, the questions, the unraveling of all pretense. At first, Saul said nothing when David's seat was empty, but on the second day, he asked Jonathan why the son of Jesse had not come. Jonathan gave the answer they had agreed upon, saying that David had asked to go to Bethlehem for the yearly family sacrifice. Then Saul's anger blazed. His words were harsh and shameful. He accused Jonathan of choosing David to his own shame. He made plain what had long been working underneath. As long as David lived, Jonathan's own future on the throne could not stand. Saul commanded that David be brought, for he must surely die. Jonathan asked once more the simplest and strongest question. Why should he be put to death? What had he done? Saul answered not with reason, but with violence. He cast his spear at his own son. Then Jonathan knew with final certainty that Saul was determined to kill David. He rose from the table in fierce grief and anger. He ate no food, for he was grieved for David because Saul had treated him shamefully. The next morning, Jonathan went into the field with a little boy, as he and David had arranged. He shot the arrows beyond the boy and cried out that they were beyond him, sending the message David needed to hear. After the boy had gone, David came from his hiding place. He fell on his face to the ground and bowed himself 3 times. They kissed one another and wept together, and David wept the more. Their farewell stands in the memory like morning light falling through tears. There are friendships given by God that feel, in certain hours, like shelter itself. Jonathan had been that to David. He had believed him when others suspected him. He had spoken for him when a king raged against him. He had strengthened his hand in God. Now the road separated them. There is no easy name for what it costs to love someone whose calling must carry them in a different direction. Jonathan had given David a friendship the court could not manufacture, and Saul's suspicion could not poison. He had seen David's anointing, and chosen to honor it rather than resist it. In that, Jonathan showed a greatness of soul that does not always accompany greatness of name. He might have been jealous. By every measure of earthly inheritance, he had reason, but he chose love. He chose the Lord's purpose over his own claim, and in choosing so, he gave David not only a friend, but a living sign of something God-shaped in human form. Jonathan told him to go in peace, because they had sworn in the name of the Lord, and the Lord would be between them and between their offspring forever. David departed. Jonathan returned to the city. The path before David narrowed into exile. He came first to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech met him trembling, asking why he was alone. David, pressed by danger and moving quickly, answered with a guarded story and asked for bread. There was no common bread at hand, only the holy bread that had been before the Lord. The priest gave it to him, and David ate. There too he asked for a weapon, for he had brought neither sword nor spear in his haste. Ahimelech told him that the sword of Goliath, wrapped behind the ephod, was there. David said there was none like that. So the old weapon from the valley of Elah was placed once more in his hand. But another man was present that day. Doeg the Edomite, chief of Saul's herdsmen, was detained there before the Lord. He saw, and what he saw would later become part of a sorrowful chain. David left Nob and fled to Achish, king of Gath. That too shows the depth of his desperation. He went into Philistine territory, the very land from which Goliath had once come. But the servants of Achish recognized him. Was this not David, they said, of whom they sang? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Fear rose again around him. So David altered his behavior before them and feigned madness. He scribbled on the doors of the gate and let spittle fall on his beard until Achish, disgusted and unwilling to receive such a man, sent him away. It is not the kind of scene people often linger over when they tell the life of David, yet it belongs to the truth of the story. The anointed one of the Lord passed through seasons that were not noble in appearance. He did not walk from victory to victory wrapped in steady dignity. He knew what it was to be hunted, cornered, afraid, and driven into humiliating places. The Lord's choice did not spare him from the wilderness. In many ways, it led him into it. From there, David escaped to the cave of Adullam. The cave becomes, in the story, almost like a dark doorway between one life and another. David had once gone in and out before Saul. Now he hid among stone and shadow, yet he was not abandoned there. His brothers and all his father's house heard of it and came down to him, and not only they, everyone who was in distress came. Everyone who was in debt came. Everyone who was bitter in soul came. Men who had been squeezed by life, men with burdens behind them and uncertainty before them, gathered themselves to David, and he became captain over them. There were about 400 men. This is the beginning of David's wilderness company. Not polished courtiers, not famous warriors, not men arranged like a royal procession. They were the burdened, the restless, the strained, the overlooked. Yet around David, they would be shaped into something more. The wilderness often becomes a place where God gathers unlikely people and teaches them faithfulness together. David, thinking also of his parents, took them to the king of Moab and asked that they might stay there until he knew what God would do for him. Even in his own uncertainty, he sought shelter for them. Soon the prophet Gad came and told David not to remain in the stronghold, but to depart and return into the land of Judah. So David obeyed and came into the forest of Hereth. Meanwhile, Saul sank deeper into suspicion. Sitting under the tamarisk tree with spear in hand and servants around him, he spoke as a man who felt betrayed by everyone near him. He accused his own people of conspiracy. He cast Jonathan's covenant with David as treachery. He measured all hearts by fear. Then Doeg, the Edomite, spoke. He told Saul that he had seen David come to Ahimelech at Nob, and that the priest had given him food and the sword of Goliath. Saul summoned Ahimelech and the priests. Ahimelech answered truthfully. Who among Saul's servants, he asked, had been more faithful than David? How could he have guessed that the king now counted David an enemy? But Saul's heart was no longer soft enough to hear innocence. He ordered that the priests be struck down. His own guards refused to lift a hand against the priests of the Lord. Doeg did not refuse. And so a dark thing was done in Israel. The city of the priests was struck, and many died there because Saul's rage had overflowed its proper bounds. It is one of the grievous shadows of Saul's decline. The hand that should have defended the worship of Israel instead turned violently against it. Only one son of Ahimelech escaped, Abiathar. He fled to David and told him what had happened. David answered with sorrow that has a particular weight. He had known, when he saw Doeg there, that the Edomite would surely tell Saul. He said that he was responsible for the deaths from Abiathar's father's house. Then he drew the young priest near and told him to stay with him and not be afraid. The one who sought David's life sought Abiathar's life also, but with David he would be safe. Thus Abiathar remained, and with him came the ephod, and with the ephod the seeking of the Lord in the wilderness. Soon word came that the Philistines were fighting against Keilah and robbing the threshing floors. David asked the Lord whether he should go and strike the Philistines. The Lord told him to go. David's men were afraid. If they were already afraid in Judah, how much more if they went against the armies at Keilah? So David inquired again, and again the Lord answered, telling him to arise and go down. David went, struck the Philistines, brought away their livestock, and saved the inhabitants of Keilah. Even as a fugitive he acted as a deliverer. He had no secure house. He had no settled throne. He had men living from rock to rock and cave to cave. Yet when there was a city in need, and the Lord told him to go, he went. This, too, belongs to his character. He did not let his own unsettled condition turn him inward so completely that he forgot the needs of others. He remained useful in the land, even while the land's king hunted him. But Keilah would not become his refuge. Saul heard that David was there, and imagined that God had delivered him into a town with gates and bars. David learned of Saul's plan and asked the Lord two searching questions. Would Saul come down, and would the men of Keilah hand David over? The Lord answered that Saul would indeed come, and that the men of the city would surrender David and his men. So David rose up with about 600 men and departed from Keilah, going wherever they could go. Loneliness settles over that scene. He had saved the city, yet the city would not save him. Human gratitude can be thin when self-preservation whispers louder. Still, the Lord preserved him. David remained in the wilderness, in strongholds and wooded places in the hill country of Ziph. Saul sought him every day, but God did not deliver him into Saul's hand. Jonathan came to David there in the woods and strengthened his hand in God. It is one of the loveliest phrases in the story. He strengthened his hand in God. He did not merely bring news. He did not merely offer sympathy. He brought David back to the Lord's promise. "Do not be afraid," Jonathan said. Saul would not find him. David would be king over Israel. Jonathan himself would be next to him. Even Saul knew that also. Then they made covenant before the Lord once more, and Jonathan returned home. But the Ziphites went to Saul and betrayed David's location. Saul praised them for having compassion on him and came down again to seek David. At one point, Saul and his men nearly closed around David, and the danger tightened like a noose around the hillside. Yet a messenger came to Saul with urgent news that the Philistines had made a raid on the land. Saul had to turn back, so the pursuit was broken off, and the place was called the Rock of Escape. From there, David went up and lived in the strongholds of En-gedi. After Saul returned from fighting the Philistines, he was told that David was in the wilderness of En-gedi. So Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel to seek him among the rocks of the wild goats. He came to a cave by the sheepfolds and went in alone. David and his men were in the innermost part of that very cave. The men with David whispered that this was the day the Lord had spoken of, the day when the enemy would be delivered into David's hand. The temptation was near, immediate, almost easy. The hunter had stepped into the darkness where the hunted waited. David rose quietly and cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Then his heart struck him. He had not killed Saul. He had not even raised his hand to wound him. Yet even in cutting the robe, David felt the inward warning that told him how near he had come to violating something holy. Saul was still the Lord's anointed. However broken Saul's kingship had become, David would not seize the kingdom by murdering the one who sat upon the throne. He restrained his men with these words and would not allow them to attack Saul. This is one of the great moments of restraint in David's life. He had been wronged. He had been hunted. He had every earthly reason to strike, but he chose reverence over vengeance. He chose patience over grasping. He chose to wait for the Lord's timing, instead of forcing the matter with blood. When Saul had gone out of the cave and continued on his way, David came out behind him and called after him, "My lord the king." Then he bowed with his face to the earth and showed respect. He asked Saul why he listened to those who said David sought his harm. "This day," David said, The king's own eyes had seen how the Lord had delivered him into David's hand in the cave. Some had urged David to kill him, but David spared him. He showed Saul the corner of the robe in his hand, as proof that there was neither evil nor rebellion in him. David said that the Lord should judge between them and avenge him if he willed, but David's own hand would not be against Saul. Saul answered with tears in his voice. Was that David's voice? His son's voice? He said that David was more righteous than he, because David had returned good where Saul had returned evil. Saul acknowledged what by now had become plain. David would surely be king, and the kingdom of Israel would be established in his hand. He asked only that David not cut off his descendants or destroy his name from his father's house. David swore it. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. He did not trust a moment's softness in Saul to be the end of the matter. The wilderness had taught him caution as well as mercy. Soon after, Samuel died. All Israel gathered and mourned him, and buried him at his house in Ramah. The old prophet who had anointed kings, who had judged Israel, who had heard the Lord's voice from youth, passed from the land. David arose and went down toward the wilderness of Paran. There was in Maon a man named Nabal, very wealthy, with many sheep and goats. His wife was Abigail, a woman of good understanding and beautiful countenance. Nabal, however, was harsh and badly behaved. David heard that Nabal was shearing his sheep, a time often marked by feasting and generosity. He sent young men with a respectful message, asking for whatever kindness Nabal might offer in return for the peace David's men had shown to Nabal's shepherds in the wilderness. David had not harmed them. Nothing had been missing from them all the while they were in Carmel. But Nabal answered with contempt. Who was David? Who was the son of Jesse? There were many servants these days, he said, who broke away from their masters. Why should he take his bread, his water, and his meat, and give it to men he did not know? The answer came back to David, and anger rose hot within him. 400 men girded on their swords. David himself girded on his sword. The insult had cut into a place already worn thin by hardship, and David determined to sweep through Nabal's house in judgment. Yet before blood could be shed, Abigail heard what had happened. A servant told her how David's men had been very good to them, like a wall by night and by day, while the shepherds kept the flock. He urged her to consider what to do, for evil was determined against their household. Abigail moved quickly. She took bread, wine, prepared sheep, parched grain, raisins and fig cakes, and loaded them on donkeys. Then she rode out to meet David, coming down hidden by the mountain. David and his men were coming toward her in anger, and she met them on the road. When Abigail saw David, she hurried, got down from her donkey, and fell before him on her face. Her words were full of wisdom and humility. She asked that the blame fall on her, and begged him not to regard Nabal, for folly was with him as his name suggested. She recognized something larger than the insult of the hour. The Lord, she said, would surely make David a sure house, because he fought the Lord's battles. Evil would not be found in him all his days. Though men rose to pursue him and seek his life, the life of David would be bound in the bundle of the living with the Lord his God. Then she spoke the word that turned David back from sin. When the Lord had done all the good he had spoken concerning David and had appointed him prince over Israel, let there be no grief to David, no cause of stumbling in heart, because he had shed blood without cause or avenged himself. The wilderness did not only give David swords and fugitives, it also gave him Abigail. A discerning woman stood in his path and reminded him who he was called to be. David blessed the Lord who had sent her. He blessed her wisdom, and he blessed her because she had kept him that day from blood guiltiness and from avenging himself by his own hand. He received the gift she had brought and sent her home in peace. Later Nabal died under the Lord's judgment, and David, hearing of it, blessed the Lord who had kept him back from evil. In time, he sent and spoke to Abigail, and she became his wife. David also had taken Ahinoam of Jezreel as wife. The story is told simply, in the manner of old narratives. Yet one can feel beneath it the Lord's providence, who not only restrains his servant from evil, but also brings comfort and wise companionship into a life of strain. Still, Saul did not cease his pursuit for long. The Ziphites came again to tell him where David was hiding. Saul rose and went down with 3,000 chosen men to seek David in the wilderness. David sent out spies and learned of Saul's coming. By night, he went down with Abishai, son of Zeruiah, into Saul's camp. There Saul lay sleeping within the camp enclosure, his spear stuck in the ground by his head, with Abner and the people around him. Abishai whispered that God had delivered Saul into David's hand that day. "Let him strike him once with the spear," he said, "and there would be no need for a second blow." But David refused again. Who, he asked, could stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As the Lord lived, the Lord himself would strike Saul, or Saul's day would come to die, or he would go down into battle and perish. But David would not do it. Instead, he took the spear and the jar of water from Saul's head, and they went away. No one awoke, for a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. From a safe distance, David called out to Abner and rebuked him for failing to guard the king. Then Saul recognized David's voice again. David asked why the king pursued his servant, and what evil was in his hand. If the Lord had stirred Saul up, David said, let an offering be accepted. But if men had stirred him, they were cursed, for they had driven David out from the inheritance of the Lord. Saul answered once more with confession and blessing. He said he had sinned. He called David his son and said he would do him no more harm. David returned the spear, but not himself. He left the matter with the Lord. Now, however, the years of pursuit had worn him down. David said in his heart that one day he would perish by Saul's hand. So he concluded there was nothing better than to escape into the land of the Philistines, where Saul would despair of seeking him any longer. This decision was not framed like his earlier inquiries of the Lord. It comes to us as the reasoning of a tired and hunted man. Even faithful hearts can speak to themselves from exhaustion. Even the anointed of the Lord can reach for shelter in mixed and difficult ways. David went again to Achish, king of Gath, this time not alone but with his 600 men and their households, and with his wives. Achish gave him Ziklag, and David lived in Philistine territory for a year and 4 months. There is complexity here. David found rest from Saul, yes, but the refuge came among old enemies, and the life he led there was marked by hard raids and careful dealings that left no witnesses to report back to Gath. Achish believed David had made himself abhorrent to Israel. David lived in a narrow, dangerous tension, outwardly under Philistine favor, while inwardly belonging still to the people of the Lord. Then the Philistines gathered again for war against Israel, and Achish expected David to go with him. David answered in words Achish took as loyalty. Yet when the Philistine princes saw David and his men passing in the rear with Achish, they did not trust him. How could they march to battle with the man of whom it had been sung? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Might he not turn in the battle and reconcile himself to Saul with the heads of Philistines? So Achish called David, and though speaking well of him, sent him away. The Lord used the mistrust of the Philistines to keep David from fighting openly against Israel. Thus David and his men returned toward Ziklag. When they came on the third day, they found the city struck and burned with fire. The Amalekites had raided the south and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They had not killed them, but had carried them away. David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. The scene is filled with ash and grief, the city blackened, the homes emptied, the families gone. Even David's 2 wives had been taken captive. And now the men who had followed him, men already bruised by years of wandering, spoke of stoning him because their souls were bitter, every man for his sons and daughters. David was greatly distressed. But here, in one of the strongest sentences of his life, the story says that David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. That line is brief in the record, but its weight is immense. He had no city behind him, no trusted counsel beside him, no calm from the men around him. He had smoke before his eyes and accusation close at hand. The men who had followed him through wilderness and cave now spoke of stoning him, their grief turned hot with blame. And yet David did not collapse into himself. He did not flee further. He did not answer bitterness with bitterness. He turned toward the only one who had never left him. He sought the Lord as he had sought him in the fields of Bethlehem, in the cave of Adullam, in the long years of fugitive trust. When everything else had narrowed to ash and accusation, the practice of a lifetime was still there. This is one of the deep lessons of David's life. He did not always choose perfectly. He did not live without fear. He was capable of grievous wrong in later years, but again and again, in his better hours, when pressed to the edge, he returned to God. He strengthened himself there. He called for Abiathar, the priest, to bring the ephod. Then David inquired of the Lord whether he should pursue the raiding band and whether he would overtake them. The answer came clearly: pursue, for you shall surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. So David went, he and the 600 men with him. At the brook Besor 200 were too exhausted to continue, and they stayed there with the baggage while 400 pressed on. In the field they found an Egyptian servant abandoned by his Amalekite master because he had fallen sick. David gave him bread and water, a cake of figs and raisins, and his spirit revived. Then the young man agreed to lead David down to the raiding party. The Amalekites were spread out over the ground, eating, drinking, and making merry over the great spoil they had taken. David struck them from twilight until the evening of the next day. Few escaped, except some young men who fled on camels. David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken. He rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything taken away. David brought back all. It was one of those mercies that come after tears have been spent, and seem almost too large for the heart to receive at once. The children were restored, the wives were restored, the plunder was restored. Everything that had been carried away was brought back. When David returned to the 200 men who had stayed by the brook, some of the harsher men among those who had fought did not want to share the spoil with those who had not gone into battle. But David answered with generosity and justice. They would not do so, he said, with what the Lord had given them. As the one who went down to battle, so also would the one who stayed with the baggage share alike. And this became a statute in Israel from that day forward. Even in victory, David did not forget the weary. He knew the difference between cowardice and exhaustion. He knew that what had been recovered was the Lord's gift. Soon after this, the final collapse of Saul's reign came. The Philistines fought against Israel on Mount Gilboa. The men of Israel fled. and many fell there. The battle pressed hard upon Saul. His sons fell, including Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. Wounded and seeing the end upon him, Saul died there on the mountain, and his armor-bearer also fell. The next day the Philistines found Saul and his sons and treated their bodies with public dishonor, fastening Saul's body to the wall of Bethshan. But the valiant men of Jabesh-Gilead, remembering how Saul had once delivered them, traveled through the night, took down the bodies, and gave them burial and mourning. Thus ended the reign that had begun with such hope. A sobering close. Saul had been chosen, anointed, empowered, and given every opportunity to walk humbly with God. Yet pride, fear, half-obedience, jealousy, and hardness of heart had hollowed out his kingship from within. By the time he fell on Gilboa, the outer collapse had only revealed what had been happening inwardly for a long time. David, meanwhile, was still in Ziklag. On the third day after returning there, a man came from Saul's camp with torn clothes and earth upon his head. He fell to the ground before David. David asked where he had come from, and the man said he had escaped from the camp of Israel. David asked how the matter had gone. Then came the heavy answer. The people had fled from the battle. Many had fallen and were dead. Saul and Jonathan his son were dead also. David asked for certainty, and the man told a story in which he claimed to have found Saul leaning upon his spear and to have killed him at Saul's own request. He brought Saul's crown and bracelet as tokens. But whatever the details of the messenger's claim, David's first response was not calculation. It was grief. He took hold of his clothes and tore them. All the men who were with him did the same. They mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul, for Jonathan his son, for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David did not rejoice that the throne was now open. He did not smile at the thought that his enemy was gone. He grieved. He grieved for the king who had hunted him. He grieved for Jonathan, the friend bound to him in covenant love. He grieved for Israel, broken in battle. The man who had claimed to strike Saul expected reward, as though David would welcome such news with secret satisfaction. Instead, David asked how he was not afraid to lift his hand against the Lord's anointed. Then David ordered that he be struck down for his own testimony, and David lamented. He took up a song for Saul and Jonathan, and taught it to the children of Judah, that the memory of that day would be carried in sorrow rather than in mockery. "How the mighty have fallen," he cried. "The beauty of Israel is slain on your high places. Tell it not in Gath. Publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon." He called the mountains of Gilboa barren of dew and rain, because there the shield of the mighty had been cast away. He remembered Saul and Jonathan as lovely and pleasant in their lives, swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. He called upon the daughters of Israel to weep for Saul, who had clothed them in scarlet and ornaments. Then his lament narrowed into the sorrow of friendship. "I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan," he said. "Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was wonderful." The wilderness had given David many hardships. It had also given him Jonathan, and now Jonathan was gone. The first great public song of David in the book of his life is not a victory song for his own advancement. It is a lament. The man after God's own heart weeps before he reigns. After the lament, David did not rush to seize what seemed now within reach. He inquired of the Lord, should he go up into one of the cities of Judah? The Lord said that he should go up. Where should he go? To Hebron. So David went up there with his wives, and with the households of the men who had been with him. They lived in the towns around Hebron, and the men of Judah came and anointed David king over the house of Judah. It was a true kingship, yet not yet the whole kingdom. The promise had begun to appear in public, but it had not reached its full shape. David did not sit at once over all Israel. He reigned first, in part. Even in this, God's ways remained patient. The years of waiting were not over, simply because Saul was gone. When David heard that the men of Jabesh-Gilead were the ones who had buried Saul, he sent them words of blessing. They had shown kindness to their lord Saul in his death, and David honored that kindness. He did not despise loyalty where it had been rightly shown. He prayed that the Lord would show them steadfast love and truth, and he himself promised to repay the kindness they had done. That gesture matters. David was not trying to erase Saul from the story of Israel. He did not begin his reign by demanding that all memory of the former king be treated as shame. He knew how to honor what could be honored, even in the house from which trouble had long come toward him. But while Judah anointed David, Abner son of Ner, captain of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth, Saul's surviving son, and made him king over the rest of Israel. So the land entered a divided season. David reigned in Hebron over Judah for 7 years and 6 months. Ishbosheth reigned over Israel under Abner's strength. The old house weakened, the new house strengthened, but the turning was not instant. There was war between the house of Saul and the house of David. The scriptures tell some of these years with grave brevity. Armies met, men fell, tensions deepened. At the pool of Gibeon, a small contest turned swiftly into a fierce battle, and Asahel, Joab's brother, fell there while recklessly pursuing Abner. The wound from that death would not soon be forgotten. Still, David's house grew stronger and stronger, while Saul's house grew weaker and weaker. Sons were born to David in Hebron. The kingdom was taking shape around him, though not yet complete. Yet all was not serene within the political struggle. The weakening of Saul's house finally turned inward. Ishbosheth rebuked Abner over a matter concerning Saul's concubine Rizpah. Abner, angry and proud, answered that he had long shown loyalty to Saul's house, and that now, since the Lord had sworn the kingdom to David, he would do what the Lord had declared and bring Israel over to David. Thus a kingdom began to move not only by public battle, but by strained loyalties, wounded pride, and the hidden currents of men's ambitions. Abner sent messengers to David, offering to bring all Israel around to him. David agreed to a covenant on one condition, that Michal, Saul's daughter, be returned to him first. Ishbosheth sent and took her back from the man to whom she had been given. Then Abner spoke with the elders of Israel and with Benjamin, reminding them that they had long desired David to reign, and that the Lord had spoken of delivering Israel by David's hand. At last Abner came to Hebron with 20 men. David made a feast for him, and Abner promised to gather all Israel so that David might reign over all his heart desired. For a moment, the long division seemed close to healing, but Joab returned from a raid and heard what had happened. He distrusted Abner completely. Whether through wounded memory, political fear, personal hatred over Asahel, or all of these together, he could not bear that Abner had come and gone in peace. Without David's knowledge, he sent for Abner to return. When Abner came back to Hebron, Joab drew him aside at the gate as if for quiet speech and struck him there. Abner died in Hebron, not on a battlefield, but under the hand of deceit. When David heard it, he declared before the Lord that he and his kingdom were guiltless of the blood of Abner. He tore his clothes and commanded mourning. The king himself followed the bier. He wept at Abner's grave. He lamented over him, asking whether Abner should die as a fool dies, with hands unbound and feet unfettered, falling before men of iniquity. The people noticed. They watched David fast and grieve, and they understood that the king had not desired Abner's death. David knew that a prince and a great man had fallen that day in Israel, and he also knew with sorrow that the sons of Zeruiah were too hard for him. Even as king over Judah, he did not yet hold every hand around him in perfect submission. That, too, is part of David's long story. The kingdom would often move under his authority, and sometimes despite his desires. Some of the hardest sorrows of his reign would come from those nearest to him. Soon after Abner's death, Ishbosheth heard of it, and his hands became feeble. All Israel was troubled. Two captains from Ishbosheth's own side, men named Baanah and Rechab, came into his house during the heat of the day, struck him while he rested, cut off his head, and fled through the night to bring the grisly token to David in Hebron. They imagined they were carrying good news. They spoke as though the Lord had avenged David that day on Saul and his offspring. But David answered them by remembering another messenger who had once thought Saul's death would earn a reward. As the Lord lived, who had redeemed his soul out of all adversity, when one had told him Saul was dead, thinking to bring good news, David had taken hold of him and put him to death. How much more, then, when wicked men had killed a righteous man in his own house upon his bed? He commanded the young men, and they struck those murderers down. Ishbosheth's head was buried in the grave of Abner at Hebron. Thus Saul's house diminished, not under David's secret knives, but under the collapse of its own unstable foundations. At last, all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron. They spoke with the plainness of people finally ready to say aloud what had long grown clear. They were David's bone and flesh. Even while Saul had been king, it had truly been David who led Israel out and brought them in. And the Lord had said that David would be shepherd of his people Israel and prince over them. So the elders came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them before the Lord. Then they anointed David king over Israel. He was 30 years old when he began to reign. He would reign 40 years in all, 7 years and 6 months over Judah in Hebron, and 33 years over all Israel and Judah in Jerusalem. The shepherd had become king. Yet even this was not an ending. It was another beginning. The kingdom needed a center. Hebron had served its time, but David now sought a city from which the united people could be gathered and governed. So he went with his men to Jerusalem against the Jebusites who lived there. The stronghold seemed secure to its inhabitants, but David took the fortress of Zion, and it became the city of David. Jerusalem would henceforth be bound to his name. A city on heights, difficult, ancient, marked by earlier peoples and older stones, became the place where David would dwell. He built around it. He established his house there. Hiram, king of Tyre, sent cedar trees, carpenters, and masons, and they built David a house. And David perceived that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for his people Israel's sake. That little phrase guards the heart from pride. David's kingdom was established, yes, but it was not for David's vanity. It was for the sake of the Lord's people. Kingship in Israel was never meant to be private self-glory. It was stewardship under God, for the good of the people God had chosen. The Philistines, hearing that David had been anointed king over Israel, came up to seek him. David went down to the stronghold and inquired of the Lord, should he go up against them? The Lord said yes, and promised to deliver them. David struck them, and said that the Lord had broken forth upon his enemies like a bursting flood. Later, when the Philistines came again, David again inquired, and the Lord gave him a different strategy. David listened, obeyed, and again the Lord gave victory. He did not assume that one victory taught him everything. He asked again. That humble returning to the Lord is one of the healthiest patterns in David's earlier reign. Success had not yet taught him self-sufficiency. He remained, in good hours, a man who asked before he acted. Once Jerusalem was secure, David set his heart on bringing the Ark of God to the city. This mattered deeply. The Ark was no ordinary object. It was the sign of the Lord's holy presence in the midst of his covenant people. The Ark called by the name of the Lord of armies who sits above the cherubim. David did not want his capital to be only a place of political rule. He wanted the life of the nation ordered around the worship of God. So he gathered chosen men, 30,000 in all, and went to bring up the ark from the house of Abinadab. The first attempt, however, was marked by zeal that was sincere but not ordered rightly. The ark was placed on a new cart. Uzzah and Ahio guided it. There was music, joy, celebration, songs and instruments sounding before the Lord. But when they came to the threshing floor and the oxen stumbled, Uzzah reached out his hand to steady the ark. And there he fell. The moment is solemn and difficult, and it has made many pause through the centuries. But its meaning is not cruelty in God. Its meaning is holiness. The ark was not to be handled as though the holy presence of God could be managed by ordinary impulse, however well meant. Israel had been given instruction about such things. Reverence is not coldness, and sincerity is not enough when the Lord has spoken clearly. David was angry and afraid that day. How could the ark of the Lord come to him? So he would not bring it into the city of David at that time, but turned it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. There it remained for 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. When David heard of that blessing, his fear gave way to better understanding. This time, the ark was brought with greater care. Those who bore it did so as it ought to be borne. Sacrifices were offered, and David, clothed in a linen ephod, danced before the Lord with all his might. This was not the dance of vanity. It was not performed for approval. It was the overflowing joy of a king whose heart knew that the Lord's presence mattered more than royal poise. Trumpets sounded. The ark came into the city. Offerings were made. David blessed the people in the name of the Lord of armies. Bread, meat, and cakes were distributed, so that the joy of worship flowed outward into shared provision. But not everyone saw the same beauty in that day. Michal, daughter of Saul, looked from the window and despised David in her heart. When he returned to bless his household, she met him with cutting words, speaking as though he had only made himself base before the eyes of servant girls. David answered that it had been before the Lord, who chose him above her father and his house to appoint him prince over Israel. He said he would be yet more humble, yet more willing to be low in his own eyes, if it was before the Lord. This exchange is sad in its own way. Michal had once helped David escape by night. She had loved him. Yet the houses from which they came, the wounds they carried, and the posture of their hearts before God had taken them far apart. She saw only indignity where David felt holy joy. So the ark rested in Jerusalem. The city of the king had become the city of the ark. And as David sat in his house of cedar, with the Lord having given him rest from surrounding enemies, another desire arose in him. He said to Nathan the prophet, "See now, he dwelt in a house of cedar, while the ark of God dwelt within curtains." Nathan, hearing the king's wish, at first told him to do what was in his heart, for the Lord was with him. But that same night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan. David would not be the one to build the house for the Lord. Instead, the Lord would speak a greater promise. Nathan was sent back to David with words of remembrance and covenant. The Lord reminded David that he had taken him from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be prince over his people Israel. He had been with David wherever he went. He had cut off his enemies. He would make David a great name. He would appoint a place for his people Israel and plant them. Then came the promise that would shine over David's house far beyond his own lifetime. The Lord told David that when his days were fulfilled and he slept with his fathers, the Lord would raise up his offspring after him. That son would build a house for the Lord's name, and the Lord would establish the throne of his kingdom forever. The Lord would be his father, and he would be his son. Even if chastening came, the Lord's steadfast love would not depart from David's house, as it had departed from Saul. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me, the Lord said. Your throne shall be established forever. This is one of the mountain peaks of the whole Old Testament. The covenant with David looks first toward Solomon, who would indeed build the temple. But it also reaches beyond Solomon, beyond the rise and fall of later kings, beyond the brokenness of Judah, beyond exile, toward the greater son who would come from David's line. Even in the quiet of this night conversation, the purposes of God were already stretching toward a kingdom no death would end. When Nathan had spoken all the words of the vision, David went in and sat before the Lord. He did not respond first with plans. He responded with wonder. "Who am I, Lord God?" he asked. "And what is my house that you have brought me thus far?" The prayer that follows is filled with humility and awe. David magnified the Lord. He said, "There was none like him." He remembered the redemption of Israel. He asked that the word spoken concerning his house be confirmed forever. He grounded his confidence not in his own merit, but in God's truth. The most beautiful thing about David in these moments is not simply that he receives a great promise. It is that the promise makes him smaller in his own eyes and larger in worship. The covenant does not puff him up. It bends him low. After this, David struck the Philistines and subdued them, struck Moab, struck Hadadezer king of Zobah, and the Syrians who came to help him. Tribute came. Spoils were dedicated to the Lord. Garrisons were placed. The Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. His name grew in the earth, but the text repeatedly turns the credit back toward the Lord who established him. David reigned over all Israel, and he executed justice and righteousness for all his people. A sweetness rests in that sentence. A king who had been hunted now gave order and justice. A man once without safe house now governed a people from a settled city. The shepherd's heart, at its best, still moved beneath the crown. Then David asked a question, shaped by memory. Was there still anyone left of Saul's house, that he might show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? That question blooms with covenant fidelity. Years had passed. Wars had been fought. The throne had been established. Yet David had not forgotten Jonathan. They found a servant of Saul's house named Ziba. Through him, David learned that Jonathan still had a son, Mephibosheth, who was lame in both feet. David sent and brought him from the house where he was living in Lo-debar. When Mephibosheth came, he fell on his face and paid homage. David called him by name. "Do not be afraid," David said. How much fear must have lived in that crippled son of Jonathan as he came into the presence of the king. Sons of fallen houses do not always expect mercy from new thrones. Yet the first word David gave him was peace. He would surely show him kindness for Jonathan his father's sake. He would restore to him all the land of Saul his father. And Mephibosheth would eat bread at David's table continually. the lame son of Jonathan, called himself a dead dog. David called him to the table. Land was restored. Servants were appointed to work it for him. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem and ate continually at the king's table, like one of the king's sons. This scene reveals something precious in David's reign. Power can become a blade. It can also become shelter. David, remembering covenant love, used the security of his throne to lift up a broken and vulnerable man. Mephibosheth came not by his own strength, but because kindness sought him. Grace often works this way. Soon another test of kingship arrived, not in the form of private memory, but in international insult. Nahash, king of the Ammonites, died, and David said he would show kindness to Hanun, son of Nahash, just as Nahash had shown kindness to him. So David sent servants to comfort Hanun concerning his father. But the princes of the Ammonites sowed suspicion. They asked Hanun whether David's servants had truly come to honor his father, or whether they had come to search and spy out the city. Hanun listened to bad counsel. He took David's servants, shaved off half their beards, cut their garments at the hips, and sent them away disgraced. When David heard it, he told the men to remain at Jericho until their beards had grown again. He did not parade their shame before the nation. He covered them with patient dignity until they could return. Then war came. The Ammonites hired Syrians. Joab led the forces of Israel and found the battle set on two fronts. He divided the men, spoke courage to his brother Abishai, and committed the outcome to the Lord. "Be courageous," he said. "Let us be strong for our people and for the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what seems good to him." So the Syrians fled before Joab, and when the Ammonites saw it, they fled also. Yet the conflict did not end at once. Hadadezer gathered strength again, but David himself later went out, struck the Syrians, and subdued them so fully that they no longer helped the Ammonites. The path was opening farther for the kingdom. Jerusalem stood secure. The ark rested there. The promise had been spoken. Victories had come. Kindness had been shown. David's throne seemed firm, his name honored, his city established. And it is precisely here, when a life seems strongest in outward form, that some of the deepest inward dangers begin to stir unnoticed. There are seasons when outward success can hide inward weakness. A city is secure. Enemies are subdued. A house is established. Songs are still sung about the Lord's favor. Yet somewhere inside the soul, watchfulness begins to loosen. So it was with David. At the turn of the year, at the season when kings ordinarily go out to battle, David sent Joab and the army to continue the war against the Ammonites. They besieged Rabbah. But David stayed at Jerusalem. The sentence is plain and heavy. It is not said that a king must always be at the front of every battle. Yet the story wants us to notice this moment. There was a place where David ought to have been more vigilant than he was. There was a fitting labor for the season, and he did not share it. The man who had once moved through wilderness and danger with alert dependence on God was now at ease in the city, while others bore the strain of war. One evening, David rose from his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. From there, he saw a woman bathing, and she was very beautiful. He inquired after her. He was told plainly that she was Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah the Hittite. The truth stood before him clearly. She was another man's wife. Uriah was not a stranger to David's kingdom. He was one of the mighty men, one of the loyal servants who fought for the king. The boundary was not hidden. The warning was not obscure, but desire, once indulged against the light, does not reason well. David sent for Bathsheba. He sinned with her. Then she returned to her house. Later word came to David that she had conceived. At that moment, one sin opened into the temptation for more. This is often the way of moral collapse. One act is seldom content to remain one act. If it is not brought into the light with immediate repentance, it begins to pull at other parts of the life, asking for concealment, then for falsehood, then for harder things still. David sent to Joab for Uriah. When Uriah came from the battlefield, David asked after Joab, after the people, after the war, and then told Uriah to go down to his house. But Uriah did not go to his house. He slept at the door of the king's house with the servants of his lord. When David asked him why, Uriah answered with a kind of integrity that only deepened the king's guilt. "The ark," he said, "and Israel and Judah were dwelling in tents. Joab and the servants of David were encamped in the open field. How then could he go into his house to eat and drink and lie with his wife? As the king lived, he would not do this thing." Uriah's faithfulness stood like a clean flame beside David's hidden wrong. The soldier would not take ease while the people of God and the ark of God remained in hardship. The king, who should have embodied that same integrity, now sought to use the soldier's homecoming to conceal his own sin. David kept Uriah. One day more, he made him eat and drink. He even sought to weaken his resolve by drink. Still, Uriah did not go down to his house. Then David wrote to Joab. The letter was carried in Uriah's own hand. And in that letter, David instructed Joab to place Uriah in the fiercest part of the battle and then draw back from him that he might be struck down. So the sin that began on a rooftop moved toward blood. Joab obeyed in the hard, practical language of war. Uriah was placed where danger was known to be greatest. The men of the city came out and fought. Some of David's servants fell, and Uriah the Hittite died also. The messenger came back with the report. Joab had anticipated that the king might ask why the battle had gone so near the wall, where danger from above was obvious. If David questioned it, the messenger was to add the words that would matter most. "Your servant Uriah the Hittite is also dead." David answered with a sentence that sounds calm on the surface and is hollow beneath. "Do not let this displease you," he said, "for the sword devours one as well as another. Make the battle stronger against the city, and overthrow it." How strange and sad it is to hear David speak like that. The man who once grieved with holy tenderness now spoke as though one death in war could simply dissolve into the general losses of battle. But heaven had not lost sight of what the king was trying to bury. Bathsheba mourned for her husband. When the mourning was past, David brought her into his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. The sentence falls without ornament. No human court had accused him. No public scandal had yet broken open. No witness at the palace gate had pieced the matter together in full. Yet the Lord saw. The Lord who looks on the heart. The Lord who had once chosen David above his brothers. The Lord who had been with him in cave and camp and court, saw the hidden thing plainly. So the Lord sent Nathan the prophet to David. Nathan did not begin by naming the king's sin directly. He told a story. Two men lived in the same city, one rich and one poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds. The poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb, which he had bought and nourished. It grew up together with him and with his children. It ate of his morsel drank from his cup, and lay in his bosom. It was like a daughter to him. A traveler came to the rich man, but instead of taking from his own abundance to prepare for the guest, the rich man took the poor man's lamb and prepared it. David's anger burned hot against the man in the story. "As the Lord lived," he said, "the man who had done this deserved death. He must restore the lamb fourfold because he had done this thing and because he had no pity." Then Nathan said the word that split the covering. "You are the man." What follows is one of the most piercing prophetic rebukes in Scripture. Nathan spoke in the name of the Lord, reminding David that God had anointed him king over Israel, delivered him out of the hand of Saul, given him his master's house, and much more. If that had been too little, the Lord would have added yet more. Why then had David despised the word of the Lord to do evil in his sight? He had struck Uriah by the sword. He had taken Uriah's wife. He had killed by the sword of the children of Ammon. Because of this, Nathan said, the sword would not depart from David's house. The judgment would not erase God's covenant love, but consequences would enter the household. What David had done secretly would bear public sorrow. The peace of his own family would be torn. David answered with no argument. He did not shift blame. He did not hide behind royal dignity. He did not harden himself like Saul once had. He said simply, "I have sinned against the Lord." That confession does not cancel the damage he has done, but it matters. It matters greatly. The difference between David and Saul is not that David sinned lightly. He sinned terribly here. The difference is that when the word of the Lord came and laid him bare, David bowed beneath it. He confessed. He did not make peace with his sin. Nathan answered that the Lord had also put away his sin, and he would not die. Yet because this deed had given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to speak evil, the child born from this union would die. Then Nathan departed. The child became very sick. David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted. He lay all night on the ground. The elders of his house sought to raise him up, but he would not. He would not eat with them. Here the king, who had once sent letters in cold concealment, became once more. The father bowed low in grief. He begged for mercy. He hoped against the sentence. Who knew, he said in effect, whether the Lord might yet be gracious? On the seventh day, the child died. The servants were afraid to tell David, wondering what he might do if he heard it. But David saw them whispering and understood. He asked whether the child was dead. They said he was. Then David rose from the ground. He washed. He anointed himself. He changed his clothes. He went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. After that, he came to his own house and asked for bread. His servants were astonished. While the child lived, he had fasted and wept. Now the child was dead, and he had risen and eaten. David answered with one of those grave, quiet sentences that carry both faith and sorrow together. While the child was alive, he had fasted because there was still room to seek mercy. But now the child was dead. Could he bring him back again? He would go to him, but the child would not return. Resignation lives here, but not despair. Grief, yes, but worship also. David bows before what he cannot change and entrusts the future to God. He does not say that the sorrow is small. He says, in effect, that the Lord remains God even within sorrow. David comforted Bathsheba, and in time she bore another son. He called his name Solomon. the Lord loved him. By Nathan the prophet, the child was also called Jedediah, beloved of the Lord. Even in the aftermath of judgment, mercy was not absent. The covenant line moved forward. The Lord's purposes had not been destroyed, though David's house would now carry wounds of its own making. Joab, still at war, sent word to David that Rabbah was near to falling, and urged the king to come and complete the taking of the city, lest the victory bear Joab's name. David gathered the rest of the people, went to Rabbah, fought against it, and took it. The campaign ended in triumph. But the inward story of the king's house had changed. From here, the sadness deepens. It is one of the hardest stretches in David's life, and it is told not to delight in human ruin, but to show how sin once sown can cast long shadows across a household. David had many children. Among them were Amnon, his firstborn, and Absalom, his son by Maacah. Absalom's sister Tamar was beautiful. Amnon became consumed with desire for her. His mind did not rest in wisdom or restraint. He listened instead to subtle counsel that taught him how to bring Tamar alone into his chamber under pretense of sickness. David, not seeing the evil that was being prepared, sent Tamar to her brother's house to prepare food for him. Tamar went. What followed was grievous. Amnon sinned gravely against his sister. He took what was not his, and then, in the cold cruelty that often follows such taking, he turned hard and contemptuous toward her. Tamar left desolate, clothed in grief and shame. Absalom received her into his house and quietly told her to remain still for the moment, but in his heart hatred toward Amnon settled and remained. David heard of all these things and was very angry. Yet the story tells us no action of judgment from him. The father grieved. The king was angry, but the needed correction did not come. That failure created another space where bitterness could grow. For 2 full years, Absalom carried the wound in silence. Then at sheep shearing time, he arranged a feast and invited the king's sons. Under cover of festivity, he ordered his servants to strike Amnon when his heart was merry with wine. So Amnon died. The king's sons fled in fear. At first, false report reached David that all his sons had been killed, and his grief burst open. Soon it became clear that only Amnon was dead, but that single death was sorrow enough. Absalom fled to Geshur, to the house of his mother's kin, and remained there 3 years. David mourned for his son every day. Notice how the grief circles back upon itself. David grieves Amnon, though Amnon had done great wickedness. He grieves Absalom also, though Absalom has now shed blood. He is king over Israel, yet in his own house he stands amidst tangled sorrow, unable to undo what has already happened. In time, Joab perceived that the king's heart longed toward Absalom. So he arranged for a wise woman from Tekoa to come before David with a carefully shaped story about a widow's last son, a story meant to awaken in David the principle of mercy toward one who was banished. David understood at length that Joab's hand was in the matter. Still, he granted that Absalom be brought back from Geshur. Yet even then, the reconciliation remained incomplete. Absalom returned to Jerusalem, but he was not allowed to see the king's face. So he lived in the city 2 full years without true restoration. The father had brought him near, yet not near enough for healing. The son was back, yet not received. Suspended between exile and embrace, Absalom's heart did not soften. The story pauses to describe him. In all Israel, there was none so much praised for beauty. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no defect in him. His hair was abundant and famous. Outwardly, he was splendid, but beauty without humility is a dangerous gift. Charm, without submission, can become a snare. Absalom wanted the king's face, and when Joab did not respond to his summons, Absalom set Joab's field on fire to force the matter. Joab came, and through him Absalom at last stood before David. The king kissed Absalom. It was a gesture of restored relation outwardly, but the deeper wound had not been healed in the fear of God. Nothing in the story suggests that Absalom's heart had become humble, or that David had truly shepherded his son through repentance and truth. The kiss came, but the seeds of rebellion were already growing beneath it. After this, Absalom prepared for himself chariots and horses, and 50 men to run before him. He rose early and stood beside the way of the gate, where men came seeking judgment from the king. Whenever someone approached with a case, Absalom called him over and asked from what city he came. Then he would say that the man's matter was good and right, but there was no one appointed by the king to hear him. Then Absalom would sigh toward imagined justice. Oh, that he were made judge in the land, and every man with a suit might come to him, and he would do him justice. When any man came near to bow before him, Absalom took him by the hand and kissed him. So he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. That phrase is exact and piercing. He stole them, not by service in the fear of God, not by patient faithfulness, not by obedience. He took them through appearance, charm, grievance, and suggestion. Rebellion often begins in the gate, in the slow poisoning of trust, in the careful presentation of self as the answer to everyone else's disappointment. After 40 years, Absalom asked leave to go to Hebron, under the appearance of fulfilling a vow he had made to the Lord. David, unsuspecting, told him to go in peace. Absalom sent spies throughout the tribes, saying that when the trumpet sounded, the people were to say, "Absalom reigns in Hebron." 200 men went with him from Jerusalem in simplicity, not knowing the conspiracy. Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor, was also drawn into the plot. The conspiracy grew strong. The people with Absalom increased continually. Then a messenger came to David in Jerusalem. The hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom. David understood at once that the city could not safely remain the place of contest. He told his servants to arise and flee, lest none escape from Absalom. Better to leave than to bring the sword into Jerusalem itself. Better to go out than have the city struck because of the struggle. So the king went forth. His household went forth. The servants passed on. The Sherethites and Pelethites passed on. The 600 Gittites who had followed him from Gath passed on. In one of the moving moments of this departure, David spoke to Ittai the Gittite and urged him not to burden himself by following a king in sudden flight. Ittai was a foreigner and recent arrival. Why should he wander with David? Yet Ittai answered with the kind of loyalty that cannot be purchased. As the Lord lived, and as the king lived, in whatever place the king should be, whether for death or for life, there also would his servant be. So David told him to pass over. All the country wept with a loud voice as the people crossed the brook Kidron. The king himself passed over, and all the people went on toward the way of the wilderness. An older echo moves through this departure. David, once driven into wilderness by Saul, now goes into wilderness again. But the grief is different. Now the enemy is not a jealous king. Now it is his own son. And Jerusalem, the city he had taken and filled with the ark and ordered with praise, lies behind him. The story that had once risen toward triumph now bends down into tears. As David left the city, Zadok and Abiathar came with the Levites carrying the ark of the covenant of God. It would have been natural, on one level, to think that the king should take the ark with him. If the throne was driven out, should not the sign of the Lord's presence go also? But David would not use the ark as a shield for his own fortunes. He told Zadok to carry the ark back into the city. If he found favor in the eyes of the Lord would bring him again and show him both the ark and its resting place. But if the Lord said he had no delight in him, then here he was. Let the Lord do to him what seemed good. Humility moves through that answer, and something trembling and reverent. David would not drag holy things into his own crisis as though they existed to secure his preferred outcome. He placed himself under the Lord's judgment and mercy. Then he arranged what wisdom he could. Zadok and Abiathar were to remain in the city, and their sons could carry word out to him from Jerusalem. David himself went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. He covered his head. He went barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads and went up weeping. It is one of the most sorrowful processions in the life of David. Once he had brought the ark into Jerusalem with dancing. Now he left Jerusalem in tears. Once the city had echoed with celebration. Now the road out of it, filled with mourning. When David heard that Ahithophel, his counselor, was among the conspirators with Absalom, he prayed a short and urgent prayer. O Lord, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Then, at the summit where God was worshipped, Hushai the Archite came to meet him, his garment torn and earth on his head. David, knowing that Hushai with him would be less useful than Hushai within the city, sent him back to Jerusalem to stand before Absalom and frustrate Ahithophel's counsel. So while David moved outward into wilderness, another quiet line of resistance moved inward into the city. Even in flight, the Lord was not without provision. A little past the summit, David was met by Ziba, servant of Mephibosheth, bringing saddled donkeys, bread, fruit, and wine for the weary. Ziba claimed that Mephibosheth had remained in Jerusalem, hoping that the kingdom of his father's house would be restored to him. In the grief and haste of the hour, David believed the report and gave Mephibosheth's goods to Ziba. The full truth of that matter would appear later. For the moment, it added another ache to the king's road, the suggestion that even covenant kindness might have been answered with quiet disloyalty. Then David came to Bahurim, and there came out from Saul's clan a man named Shimei son of Gera. He cursed as he came. He threw stones. He cast dust. He cried out against David as a man of blood and ruin, saying that the Lord had returned upon him all the blood of Saul's house, and had delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom. Abishai, fierce as ever, asked why this dead dog should curse his lord the king, and requested leave to strike him down. But David restrained him. What had he to do with the sons of Zeruiah in such an hour? If Shimei cursed, perhaps the Lord had permitted it. Perhaps the Lord would look upon David's affliction and repay him with good for that cursing. It is remarkable how different David sounds here from the rooftop king who had sent death by letter. Affliction had returned him, at least in part, to humble dependence. He no longer stood as a man protected by unchallenged rule. He stood as one chastened, one who knew he was under the searching eye of God. So he let the insult fall and kept walking. Absalom entered Jerusalem. Hushai met him with cries of, "Long live the king." Absalom questioned why David's friend had not gone with David. Hushai answered with careful words, saying he would serve the one whom the Lord and the people had chosen, just as he had served the father before the son. The answer satisfied Absalom enough for the moment. Then Ahithophel gave counsel meant to harden the rebellion beyond return. He told Absalom to publicly take what belonged to his father's house, so that all Israel would know the break was complete, and the hands of Absalom's supporters would be strengthened. And so a deep humiliation came upon David's household under the open sky of Jerusalem, fulfilling in bitter measure Nathan's earlier word that what David had done in secret would bear public consequence. The judgment was not random. It was not disconnected from the king's earlier sin. The sword had indeed entered his house, and the shame David had once brought upon another man now returned, in another form, against his own household. After this, Ahithophel offered another counsel. Let him choose 12,000 men and pursue David that very night. David was weary, he said, and his hands were weak. Strike only the king, and all the people could be brought back in peace. By the measure of swift political efficiency, it was a dangerous and perhaps very wise counsel. But Absalom called Hushai also, to hear what he would say. Hushai spoke differently. He painted David not as a broken old man, but as a seasoned warrior, fierce and cunning, one who would not be sleeping among the people but hiding in some pit or other place. If the first attack miscarried even slightly, fear would spread. Better, Hushai suggested, to gather all Israel from Dan to Beersheba in vast array, and have Absalom himself go into battle with splendor and overwhelming force. The delay hidden in that counsel was exactly what David needed, and the Lord ordained it. Absalom and the men of Israel said that Hushai's counsel was better than Ahithophel's, because the Lord had appointed to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, to the intent that he might bring evil upon Absalom. When Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he set his house in order and died. The man whose word had once seemed as if one inquired at the very sanctuary of God, now passed from the story in silence and despair. Meanwhile, Hushai quickly sent word through Zadok, Abiathar, and their sons that David should not remain near the fords, but must cross over without delay, lest the king and those with him be swallowed up. There were close moments, even then. The young messengers had to hide. A woman protected them in her house and covered a well with cloth so that Absalom's servants would not find them. At last, the message reached David. So David and all the people with him passed over the Jordan by morning light. They came to Mahanaim. There, in that place of refuge, the Lord again provided through human kindness. Men of means and loyalty brought bedding, basins, earthen vessels, wheat, barley, flour, parched grain, beans, lentils, honey, butter, sheep, and curds for David and the people with him. They knew the people were hungry, weary, and thirsty in the wilderness. Among those who showed such kindness was Barzillai the Gileadite, already advanced in years, but rich in generosity. The king, who once had much, now received like a pilgrim. The wilderness had returned, and with it came the old pattern of God's faithfulness through unexpected hands. Absalom crossed the Jordan also, and all the men of Israel with him. He set Amasa over the army in place of Joab. The matter had become open war. David organized his people under Joab, Abishai, and Ittai the Gittite. He intended at first to go out himself with them, but the people would not allow it. If they fled, they said, it would not matter as much. If half of them died, it would not matter as much. But David himself was worth 10,000 of them. Better that he remain in the city and be ready to send help. So the king stood by the gate as the people went out by hundreds and by thousands. Then he gave a command that shows the fracture in his heart. Deal gently for my sake with the young man. Even with Absalom, the commanders heard it. The soldiers heard it. They went to battle, carrying not only the king's cause, but also the king's sorrow. The battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. There Israel was struck before the servants of David, and a great slaughter took place. The forest itself, the text says, devoured more people that day than the sword did. It is an eerie phrase, one that makes the woods seem almost to participate in the judgment, with ravines and branches and confusion taking their toll upon the fleeing. Absalom rode upon his mule. Passing under the thick boughs of a great oak, he was caught there and left hanging between heaven and earth while the mule went on beneath him. A man saw it and reported it to Joab. Joab asked why the man had not struck him there, but the man answered that he would not lift his hand against the king's son. Everyone had heard the king's command to deal gently with the young man. Joab, however, would not wait. He took darts in his hand and struck Absalom while he was yet alive in the tree. Then others, surrounding him, completed the act. Absalom was taken down and cast into a great pit in the forest, and a very great heap of stones was raised over him. The monument he had once set up for his own name could not preserve him. The hearts he had stolen could not keep him alive. Beauty, charm, ambition, cunning, public favor, all had carried him only as far as judgment. Yet the sorrow of the story does not end with the rebels' fall. News had to return to David. Ahimaaz wanted to run with it, but Joab at first refused him, because this was not the sort of message a man should delight to bear. In the end, both a Cushite and Ahimaaz ran, with Ahimaaz outrunning the other and arriving first. David sat between the two gates, waiting. The watchman saw runners coming and cried out. David, with a father's heart still holding hope against reason, asked not first about the battle's full outcome, but about the young man Absalom. Ahimaaz could not bring himself to say clearly what had happened. Then the Cushite arrived and spoke the victory more plainly. When David again asked whether it was well with the young man Absalom, the answer came in a form that told him everything. May the enemies of the king, and all who rise up against him to do him harm, be as that young man is. Then the king was deeply moved. He went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. As he went, he cried, "My son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." This lament is not political, not measured, not kingly in the narrow public sense. It is the voice of a father broken open by the loss of a son who had become his enemy, and yet had never ceased to be his son. There is grief that defies easy explanation. A son had risen against him. A son had dishonored his household in public view. A son had taken men of Israel and made war upon the Lord's anointed. And still the father's heart could not find rest in the rebel's fall. The mystery of parental love is that it does not always wait for the beloved to deserve it. It often simply remains, aching in the dark. The victory that day was turned into mourning for the people, because they heard that the king grieved for his son. Those who had gone out and risked their lives for David came back into the city as men ashamed, as though battle had not been won at all. Then Joab came to David with hard words. They were not gentle, and Joab was not always a righteous man, but here he spoke a truth the king needed to hear. By grieving in this public way without regard for those who had saved his life and the lives of his household, David was shaming his servants. If Absalom had lived and all the others died, Joab said, it would have pleased him better. David must rise, go out, and speak comfort to his servants, or none would remain with him that night. So David rose and sat in the gate. The people came before him. The king resumed his place. Thus private grief and public duty met in painful tension. David did not cease to love Absalom, but he had to go on leading the living. All Israel now stood in uncertainty. The people argued among themselves. David had delivered them from many enemies and saved them from the Philistines, yet they had followed Absalom. Now Absalom was dead in battle. Why did they not speak of bringing the king back? David sent word through Zadok and Abiathar to the elders of Judah, asking why they should be the last to bring the king back to his house when all Israel was already speaking of it. He also sent a message to Amasa, promising to make him commander of the army in place of Joab. So the heart of the men of Judah was moved as one man, and they sent for David to return. The king came to the Jordan, and Judah came to Gilgal to bring him over. There Shimei, who had cursed him on the road out, hurried down with men of Benjamin and fell before the king, confessing his sin. Abishai again wished to put him to death for cursing the Lord's anointed, but David refused. "Shall any man be put to death today in Israel?" he asked. Did he not know that he was king over Israel that day? Mercy marked the return. Shimei would not die. Then Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, came down to meet the king. He had not cared for his feet or beard or clothes from the day David departed until the day he returned in peace. When David asked why he had not gone with him, Mephibosheth explained that Ziba had deceived him. Being lame, he had depended on that servant and been slandered before the king. Yet he added with touching simplicity that David was as an angel of God to him, and that since the king had restored him before, he would accept what the king thought good. David, perhaps weary of sorting competing loyalties in that hour, told Mephibosheth and Ziba to divide the land. But Mephibosheth answered that Ziba could take it all, because his lord the king had come again in peace. That answer reveals a heart more attached to David's safe return than to property. The kindness shown long ago at the king's table had not been forgotten. Then Barzillai the Gileadite came to conduct the king over the Jordan. David invited the old man to come with him to Jerusalem, that he might be sustained there. But Barzillai, now very aged, answered with wise restraint. How many years remained to him? Could he still taste what he ate and drank? Could he hear clearly the voices of singers? Why should he be a burden to the king? Let him instead return and die in his own city near the grave of his father and mother. But he commended Chimham, who might go with the king in his place. So the king kissed Barzillai and blessed him. It is one of the quieter, tender moments in the latter life of David. Gratitude is given, honor is shown, old faithfulness is remembered. Yet even during the return, strife broke out between Judah and the other tribes over who had the greater claim in bringing the king back. The kingdom was restored, but not healed of every crack, and soon another rebellion rose. A man named Sheba, son of Bichri, a Benjamite, blew the trumpet and cried that the people had no portion in David, no inheritance in the son of Jesse. So the men of Israel followed Sheba, but the men of Judah stayed with the king. David came back to Jerusalem and dealt first with the sorrow left in his own house, placing the women who had kept the palace under protection and provision, though the days of their former life were over. Then he ordered Amasa to gather the men of Judah quickly to pursue the new rebel. But Amasa delayed beyond the appointed time. So David sent Abishai, and Joab went also. On the road, Joab met Amasa and greeted him as though in peace, then struck him down with sudden violence. Once again, Joab took matters into his own hands and removed the rival command David had named in his place. The pursuit continued after Sheba. He fled north from tribe to tribe until he entered Abel of Beth-Makkah. Joab's forces besieged the city and began to batter the wall. Then a wise woman from the city cried out and asked to speak with Joab. "Why," she asked, "should he swallow up the inheritance of the Lord?" The city was peaceful and faithful in Israel. Joab answered that he had no desire to destroy the city, but only sought the man Sheba, who had lifted up his hand against King David. Deliver him, and the army would depart. The woman, with decisive wisdom, persuaded her people. Sheba was struck down, and his head was cast over the wall to Joab. Then Joab blew the trumpet, and the siege ended. The people dispersed, and Joab returned to Jerusalem to the king. Thus the rebellion ended not through prolonged ruin, but through the counsel of a wise woman and the removal of one restless man. David's throne stood once more. Yet by now, the life of the kingdom had grown sober. The early brightness of David's rise had not disappeared entirely, but it was threaded through with grief, loss, consequence, and the hard knowledge that a kingdom can be established outwardly while the household within it bears many scars. Later, another solemn matter came upon the land. There was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. The king sought the face of the Lord, and the Lord revealed that the matter lay in blood guilt connected with Saul's house and with what had been done against the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites were not of Israel, yet Israel had once sworn to spare them. Saul, in misguided zeal, had sought to wipe them out. David called the Gibeonites and asked what should be done to make atonement, that they might bless the inheritance of the Lord. The answer that followed is one of the graver and more difficult moments in the record. Justice long delayed had left wounds in the land, and the settlement required a costly reckoning tied to the old house of Saul. David acted, but he spared Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, because of the oath between himself and Jonathan. Even here, in a stern and sorrowful matter, covenant mercy toward Jonathan's line still held. What many remember most from this episode is not the political settlement itself, but Rizpah. Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, spread sackcloth for herself upon a rock from the beginning of harvest until rain fell from heaven. She kept watch day after day and night after night, refusing to let the birds of the sky rest on the bodies by day or the beasts of the field by night. A fierce tenderness lives in that vigil, a mother in grief, guarding what remained, a silent figure beneath open sky, enduring heat and darkness alike. Her sorrow became known to David, and David responded. He went and took the bones of Saul and Jonathan from Jabesh Gilead, where they had been preserved after the disaster of Gilboa, and he gathered also the remains of those who had fallen in this later reckoning. They were buried honorably in the tomb of Kish, Saul's father. After that, God answered prayer for the land. Then there were more battles against the Philistines. David went down with his servants and fought, but there came a day when he grew faint beneath the strain. One of the descendants of the giant thought to kill him, but Abishai came to his help and struck the enemy down. After this, the men of David swore that the king must not go out to battle with them any more, lest the lamp of Israel be quenched. The years were moving on. The shepherd of Bethlehem, who had once run fresh-footed into the valley against Goliath, now carried the weariness of many campaigns upon his body. He was still David, still beloved, still strong in spirit, but time had begun to lay its hand upon him. Other Philistine champions fell in those later wars, some by the hands of David's servants, some by men of his family. The old enmity that had shadowed Israel for so long continued to break under the hand of God working through David's house. Then, in one of the most beautiful turns in the record, the narrative pauses and lets David speak at length to the Lord. He spoke to the Lord the words of a song in the day, when the Lord had delivered him out of the hand of all his enemies and out of the hand of Saul. This song is not merely an ornament in the story. It is a window into David's heart after long years. It is what rises from him when he looks back across caves and crowns, tears and victories, dangers and deliverances, and tries to say what the Lord has been. He begins not with himself, but with God. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer, my God, in whom I take refuge, my shield, the horn of my salvation, my high tower, my refuge, my Savior. You save me from violence. Listen to how personal the words are. Not simply a rock, my rock. Not simply deliverance, my deliverer. The life of David had been filled with public events, but the faith beneath them remained deeply personal. He had met God not only in national victories, but in intimate rescue, in private fear, in the immediate experience of being upheld when he might otherwise have fallen. He said that the waves of death had surrounded him, and the floods of ungodliness made him afraid. The cords of Sheol were around him. The snares of death confronted him. In his distress, he called upon the Lord, and the Lord heard his voice from his temple. Then the song swells into images of divine majesty. The earth shook and trembled. The foundations of heaven quaked. Smoke went up. Fire came forth. The Lord bowed the heavens and came down. Darkness was under his feet. He rode upon a cherub and flew. He was seen upon the wings of the wind. These are not the measured phrases of a scribe making a careful report. These are the words of a worshipper trying to describe what it feels like when God acts for his servant. David is not saying that every rescue came with literal thunder before his eyes. He is saying that when the Lord delivered him, it was as though all creation answered to that deliverance. The living God is not distant. He is not a passive observer. He bends heaven toward his people. David said that the Lord sent from on high and took him. He drew him out of many waters. He delivered him from his strong enemy and from those who hated him, for they were too mighty for him. That phrase is worth sitting with for a moment. They were too mighty for me. David, the slayer of Goliath, the conqueror of cities, the king whose name had traveled beyond Israel, still confessed that many of his enemies had been too mighty for him. He did not retell his life as though he himself had been sufficient. The song of David is not self-congratulation dressed as piety. It is the confession of a man who knows that without God he would have been overwhelmed many times over. The Lord brought him out into a broad place. The Lord delivered him because he delighted in him. That line glows softly in the song, not merely because David was useful, not merely because David had a role to play in history, but because the Lord delighted in him. There is tenderness in that. The God of covenant, the God of thunder and righteousness, also delights in his servant. David goes on to speak of walking in the Lord's ways and of being rewarded according to righteousness. These words must be heard in the larger shape of his life. They are not the claim of a sinless man. By the time this song stands in the record, the story has already told us otherwise. Rather, David is speaking of the fundamental direction of his allegiance, of the reality that he did not set himself to abandon the Lord, that when he sinned he returned, that he was not a man at peace with wickedness as his settled habitation. He says, "With the merciful, you will show yourself merciful. With the blameless, you will show yourself blameless. With the pure, you will show yourself pure. But with the crooked, you will show yourself shrewd. You save the afflicted people," he says, "but your eyes are upon the haughty to bring them down." These are lessons learned in caves and courts alike. David had seen the proud rise high and fall hard. He had seen the humble sustained. He had seen God resist what was twisted and uphold what clung to him in faith. Then comes another line, "Beloved through the generations. You are my lamp, O Lord. The Lord lights my darkness." That sentence suits a man who knew many dark valleys. It suits the fugitive hiding in wilderness. the father weeping over sons, the king carrying hidden guilt to confession, the old man remembering enemies and mercies. The Lord lights my darkness. Not all darkness vanishes at once. Not every road becomes noon. But the Lord brings light enough to walk, light enough to continue, light enough to hope. By you, David says, I run against a troop. By my God, I leap over a wall. As for God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord is tested. He is a shield to all who take refuge in him. Who is God besides the Lord? Who is a rock besides our God? The song keeps moving between strength and gratitude. God is David's strong fortress. He makes his way perfect. He makes his feet like the feet of a deer and sets him upon high places. He teaches his hands to war. He gives the shield of salvation. And then comes a line as gentle as any in the song. Your gentleness has made me great. David knew force. He knew battle. He knew what it meant to break through enemies. Yet when he looked deepest into the making of his life, he saw not only the power of God, but the gentleness of God. A gentleness that sustained him. A gentleness that restrained him. A gentleness that received him when he repented. A gentleness that did not cast him away when he had cause to fear being cast away. Your gentleness has made me great. This is not a phrase the proud invent. It belongs to a man who has been handled by mercy. David continues through the victories the Lord gave, through enemies subdued, through nations brought low, through deliverance from violent men. At the end of the song, he turns again to praise. The Lord lives. Blessed be my rock. Exalted be God, the rock of my salvation. Therefore I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the nations, and sing praises to your name. He gives great deliverance to his king, and shows steadfast love to his anointed, to David and to his offspring forever. Thus the song closes where covenant and praise meet. David's life is not merely one man's biography. It is part of a promise stretching forward. The mercy shown to David would continue beyond David. After the song, the record gives what are called the last words of David. Again, he speaks not first of himself, but as one carried by the Spirit. The Spirit of the Lord spoke by him. His word was on David's tongue. The God of Israel, the Rock of Israel, had spoken. One who rules over men justly, David says, ruling in the fear of God, is like the light of morning when the sun rises, like a morning without clouds, when the tender grass springs out of the earth by clear shining after rain. It is a beautiful image of righteous rule, not oppressive, not dark, not sharp with vanity, but like the first clean light over wet ground, bringing life gently upward. And yet, David knows that his own house has not always looked like that bright morning. So there is humility even here. Although his house is not so with God, yet God has made with him an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and sure. This, David says, is all his salvation and all his desire. He rests at last, not in the perfection of his own house, but in the certainty of God's covenant. Then the record turns to the mighty men. Names are given. Deeds are remembered. Valor is honored. David did not stand alone in the work the Lord gave him. Men gathered around him and fought with faithfulness. Some held the field when others fled. Some struck down great enemies. Some were renowned among the 3, some among the 30. Their names are part of the memory of the kingdom, because faithfulness in hard places deserves to be remembered. One seen among them glows with special tenderness. David was in the stronghold, and the garrison of the Philistines was then in Bethlehem. In a moment of longing, he said, almost like a sigh given to the air, "Oh, that someone would give me water to drink from the well of Bethlehem, which is by the gate." 3 mighty men heard him. They broke through the camp of the Philistines, drew water from the well by the gate of Bethlehem, and brought it back to David. But when they placed it before him, he would not drink it. Instead, he poured it out before the Lord. "Far be it from me," he said, "to drink what had been brought at such risk. Was it not like the blood of the men who had gone in jeopardy of their lives?" So he poured it out to the Lord. That moment reveals David's heart in a quiet way. He had spoken a longing. Others had made that longing costly. He refused to turn such devotion into private pleasure. What was too precious to be used lightly became an offering. So the water of Bethlehem returned to God as worship. Among the mighty men, one name stands in solemn brightness, even among the celebrated list: Uriah the Hittite. The same man whose loyalty David once betrayed now stands recorded among the honored warriors of the king. The Bible does not let David forget him. It does not let us forget him either. Grace does not erase memory. It redeems the sinner, but it does not pretend the wound never happened. Then came another late sorrow. Again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and David was moved to number the people. Why the counting became sinful here is not explained in simple arithmetic terms, but the story makes clear that something in it displeased God. Perhaps pride, perhaps misplaced security, perhaps a desire to measure what ought only to have been received with trust. Joab himself, not usually a tender conscience, questioned the king. Why delight in this thing? Yet the king's word prevailed. So Joab and the captains went out through the land, from tribe to tribe, counting the people. It took 9 months and 20 days. At the end, they returned and gave the total. Then David's heart struck him. He said to the Lord that he had sinned greatly in what he had done and had acted very foolishly. Again, the pattern appears. David acts wrongly. His heart is pierced. He confesses. It does not undo the act, but it is still the true road home. The prophet Gad came to him in the morning with a hard word. 3 judgments were set before David: years of famine, months of fleeing before enemies, or days of pestilence in the land. David answered with grief and with a strange, humble wisdom. "Let us fall now into the hand of the Lord," he said, "for his mercies are great. Let me not fall into the hand of man." So pestilence came upon Israel. Many died. The land felt the weight of the king's wrong. But when the destroying angel stretched out his hand toward Jerusalem, the Lord relented of the disaster and said, "It is enough. Withdraw your hand." David saw the angel and spoke to the Lord. He confessed again that he was the one who had sinned and done perversely. "But these sheep," he asked, "what had they done? Let the hand fall upon him and his father's house." Gad told David to go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So David went. Araunah saw the king coming and bowed low. When he learned why David had come, he offered the threshing floor, the oxen, the wood, all of it freely for sacrifice. But David answered with words that have become a standard for every true offering. No, he would surely buy it for a price. He would not offer burnt offerings to the Lord his God that cost him nothing. The truth of it runs deep. Worship without cost is easily made casual. The heart honors most what it gives up truly. David bought the place. He built an altar there. He offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. And the Lord was entreated for the land, and the plague was stayed. That threshing floor would matter long after David. It would stand bound to the future Temple Mount, to the place where later generations would bring offerings before the Lord. Once again, even through failure, God was shaping holy history. Now the years gathered thickly around David. The battles were behind him more than before him. The city stood. The ark rested. The covenant had been spoken. The household had known grief. The kingdom had been preserved, and the old shepherd king was drawing near the end of his days. Now King David was old and advanced in years. The body that had walked hills, fled spears, danced before the ark, and borne armor, grief, and rule for decades no longer held warmth easily. They covered him with garments, but he could not keep warm. So a young woman named Abishag the Shunammite was brought to serve the king and care for him. She attended to him in his frailty, and the record is careful to say that the king did not take her as a wife. Age does this quiet work upon even the strongest. The hand that once gripped sling and harp alike grows thin. The step, once quick, on rocky paths slows. The eyes that had seen battles and psalms and suns and altars now look more often toward memory than toward new campaigns. But even in old age, while David's own strength waned, the question of the kingdom's future rose urgently around him. Adonijah, son of Haggith, exalted himself and said, "I will be king." He was handsome, born after Absalom, and the text notes with quiet sadness that his father had never once rebuked him or asked why he acted as he did. There are patterns in David's house that repeat. A son grows beautiful and ambitious. A father, perhaps weary, perhaps indulgent, does not restrain him as he should. And the unchecked self begins to reach upward. Adonijah prepared chariots and horsemen for himself, and 50 men to run before him. Joab sided with him. Abiathar the priest sided with him. They gathered at the stone of Zoheleth near on Rogel and held a feast, calling many of the king's sons and many of Judah's men. But they had not called Nathan the prophet, nor Benaiah son of Jehoiada, nor Solomon. Nathan saw the danger clearly. David's age had left room for those around him to move quickly. So Nathan went to Bathsheba, mother of Solomon, and asked whether she had heard that Adonijah was reigning while David knew nothing of it. Then he gave wise counsel. Bathsheba was to go in to David and remind him of the oath that Solomon would reign after him. While she spoke, Nathan himself would come in after and confirm the matter. So Bathsheba went into the king. The room was quiet with old age. Abishag served near. David listened. Bathsheba bowed before him and reminded him of his word. Had he not sworn that Solomon her son would reign after him and sit upon his throne? Yet now Adonijah had exalted himself, sacrificing oxen and sheep and calling many of the king's sons Joab and Abiathar. The eyes of all Israel, she said, were on the king, that he should tell them who would sit on the throne after him. Otherwise, when David slept with his fathers, she and Solomon would be counted offenders. While she was still speaking, Nathan entered and repeated the matter with prophetic clarity. Had the king said that Adonijah should reign? If so, why had the prophet, Zadok, Benaiah, and Solomon not been invited? The moment required decision. Then David rose in clarity. "Call Bathsheba," he said. And when she stood again before him, He swore by the Lord who had redeemed his soul out of all adversity that Solomon her son would reign after him and would sit upon his throne that very day. The old king still had authority. Though wrapped in weakness, he had not surrendered the power to speak the future into public form. Then David gave orders that were to leave no room for doubt. Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah son of Jehoiada were to take Solomon and set him on the king's own mule. They were to bring him down to Gihon. There Zadok and Nathan were to anoint him king over Israel. The trumpet was to be blown, and the cry raised, "Long live King Solomon." Then they were to bring him up again, and he would come and sit upon David's throne. Benaiah answered with wholehearted assent. "Amen," he said. "May the Lord, the God of the king, say so." As the Lord had been with David, so might he be with Solomon, and make his throne greater. So they went. Joy moves through the scene at Gihon. Priest and prophet, the king's mighty servant beside them, the royal mule led forward, the horn of oil raised, the trumpet at the ready, the people assembled. Solomon was anointed. They blew the trumpet, and all the people said, "Long live King Solomon." Then they came up after him, with pipes sounding, and the people rejoicing greatly, so that the earth seemed to split with their noise. While Adonijah and his guests were still feasting, they heard the sound from the city. Jonathan, son of Abiathar, came with the news. "Most certainly," he said, "King David had made Solomon king." Zadok, Nathan, and Benaiah had anointed him at Gihon, and all the city rang again with rejoicing. At once, the feast of self-exaltation fell apart. Adonijah's guests were afraid and rose each to his own way. Adonijah himself, fearing Solomon, took hold of the horns of the altar. The altar became, for one more anxious man, the place to which fear ran when earthly plans collapsed. Word came to Solomon, and he answered with measured wisdom. If Adonijah proved himself a worthy man, not one hair of him would fall to the earth. But if wickedness were found in him, he would die. So Adonijah came, bowed himself before King Solomon, and Solomon sent him to his house. Then David came near to the end. When his days drew close that he should die, he charged Solomon his son. The charge begins with the tenderness and gravity of an old father speaking to a son who must soon stand where he himself has stood. "I am going the way of all the earth," David said. "Be strong, therefore, and show yourself a man. Keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, commandments, ordinances, and testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you turn yourself." Then, David said, the Lord would establish the word he had spoken concerning his house, if his sons walked faithfully before him with all their heart and soul. This is the center of David's final counsel. Not military cleverness, not courtly finesse, not merely the management of rivals. Walk in the ways of the Lord. The king who had sinned grievously and been restored knew, perhaps more than many others, that the true stability of the throne did not lie in charisma or force. It lay in covenant faithfulness. After that central charge, David also spoke of unfinished matters that still touched the kingdom. He remembered the violence of Joab, who had shed blood in times of peace and acted with a hand too ready to take judgment for itself. He remembered the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite, who had shown kindness when David fled from Absalom, and he urged Solomon to show them kindness in return. He spoke also of Shimei son of Gera, who had cursed him grievously when he left Jerusalem, though David had sworn not to kill him then. These final instructions are complex, as final political instructions often are. David knew the kingdom passed to Solomon not in some clean world untouched by old wrongs, But in the real world of unfinished loyalties, dangerous men, remembered mercies, and consequences still in motion. Then David slept with his fathers. He was buried in the city of David. The years of his reign were counted: 7 years over Judah in Hebron, and 33 years over all Israel in Jerusalem. 40 years. A shepherd's lifetime under God. A king's lifetime under promise. A flawed and chastened lifetime under mercy. Solomon sat upon the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was firmly established. Yet the transition still required firmness. Adonijah, not content with mercy, later sought Bathsheba and asked her to request Abishag the Shunammite for him. Bathsheba went innocently enough with the petition to Solomon, but Solomon saw in it more than a household arrangement. In the language of royal courts, it was another reaching toward the symbols of the kingdom. Adonijah had not ceased desiring what had not been given him. So Solomon judged the matter, and Adonijah's life ended. Abiathar, who had supported Adonijah, was sent away from the priesthood to Anathoth. Solomon did not kill him, because he had borne the ark before David and had shared affliction with the king in earlier days. Yet he was removed from public office, and thus the old word against Eli's house moved further toward fulfillment. When Joab heard what had happened, he fled to the tent of the Lord and took hold of the horns of the altar, as Adonijah had done before him. But Joab's history was long and stained with blood he had shed without command, Abner, Amasa, and other acts of fierce self-will. Solomon ordered the justice be done. Joab died there, and the blood was reckoned back upon his own head rather than remaining on the house of David. Then came the matter of Shimei. Solomon placed him under clear instruction. He might dwell in Jerusalem and not go out beyond the brook Kidron. On the day he crossed it, he would surely die. Shimei agreed. For a time, he stayed. But later, when 2 servants fled from him to Gath, he saddled his donkey and went after them, crossing the boundary he had sworn not to cross. When word came to Solomon, the king reminded him of the oath and of the evil he had done to David. Thus Shimei also fell under judgment, and the kingdom was established in Solomon's hand. These final acts are stern, and they belong to the sober end of David's story. The kingdom did not pass into Solomon's care like a candle being set gently on a table in an empty room. It passed through the real and dangerous tensions of a court where loyalty, ambition, priesthood, blood guilt, and memory all had to be faced. Yet beyond those sharp edges, a gentler and larger truth remains. David's life had ended. The promise had not. Solomon now sat upon the throne. The son of David would build the house his father had long desired to build. The city would continue. The covenant word would continue. And beyond Solomon, beyond all the kings who would come after, beyond the bright days and the dark days still ahead for Judah, the greater promise would continue still. When we look back over David's life in the quiet of night, what do we see? We see a shepherd in Bethlehem's fields, learning God under the stars. We see oil running down in secret, while older brothers stand nearby. We see a harp sounding in a troubled chamber. We see a giant falling in a valley because the battle belongs to the Lord. We see covenant friendship. We see caves, dust, and wilderness mercy. We see a king who will not raise his hand against Saul though he has every chance. We see dancing before the ark. We see the promise of an everlasting house. We see kindness shown to Mephibosheth at the table. We see terrible sin. We see prophetic rebuke. We see repentance that does not excuse, but truly bends low. We see family grief, rebellion, tears on the Mount of Olives, and the cry of a father over a lost son. We see songs in the night and prayers after deliverance. We see an altar bought at full price. We see an old king giving his son into the future with both blessing and warning. And perhaps, most of all, we see this. David was not called a man after God's heart because he never failed. He failed deeply. He was called that because beneath the failures, beneath the courage and the fear, beneath the splendor and the grief, his life kept returning to the Lord. When confronted, he confessed. When pursued, he prayed. When delivered, he praised. When promised, he bowed in wonder. When guilty, he sought mercy. When old, he still spoke of the covenant. This is the steady lesson his life leaves behind. Grace does not make sin small. Mercy does not pretend the wound was never made. The Lord's forgiveness is not shallow, and his holiness is not soft in the careless sense. David's story teaches us something richer and truer. It teaches that the Lord can look with mercy upon a broken heart, without calling evil good. It teaches that repentance is not a performance of sadness, but a turning of the whole person back toward God. It teaches that consequences may remain, and yet hope may remain also. It teaches that God can continue his promise through a life that has been chastened, humbled, and made honest. That is why David's songs still speak so tenderly in the night. They were not written by someone who only knew bright mornings. They were sung by one who had known fear in caves, guilt in the soul, enemies at the gate, betrayal in his own house, and grief too deep for easy words. He knew what it was to ask for cleansing. He knew what it was to wait. He knew what it was to say that the Lord was his shepherd, not as a decorative phrase, but as a confession from a man who had once been a shepherd himself. He knew what it was to be guided, restored, corrected, and kept. In David, we learn that the hidden years are not wasted. The sheepfold can be a school of kingship. The lonely hill can become a place of worship. The small act of faithfulness can prepare a soul for a larger obedience. We learn that victory is safest when it gives glory back to God. A sling and a stone can become mighty when trust is placed not in the weapon, but in the Lord of hosts. We learn that waiting matters. David had chances to seize what had been promised, but again and again he refused to take by violence what God had not yet given by providence. His patience was not perfect, but it was real. He would rather wait in the wilderness than become king by a hand stained against the Lord's anointed. We learn, too, that success is dangerous when watchfulness sleeps. The palace can be more perilous than the cave. Comfort can dull a heart that danger once kept awake. The story of Bathsheba and Uriah remains a solemn warning, not to shame the listener into despair, but to remind every heart that holiness must be guarded most carefully when life appears most secure. And we learn that the Lord's word is stronger than any human life, even a life as great as David's. David dies. The promise continues. The king is buried. The covenant remains awake. He was not the sinless king. He was the waiting king, the singer king, the chastened king, the king whose story, for all its beauty, still made the heart of Israel look ahead for another son of David, another king, one greater than the shepherd of Bethlehem, though born in Bethlehem too, one who would not merely speak of God as rock and refuge, but would himself become refuge, one who would not only spare enemies but bear their sin, one whose kingdom would know no end. For Christian listeners, this is where the line of David glows with its deepest meaning. The promise given in David's house does not fade with Solomon. It moves through generations, through bright kings and broken kings, through exile and return, through waiting and longing, until at last the angel speaks of David's throne in the house of Nazareth, and the child born in Bethlehem is proclaimed as Savior and King. But for tonight, we leave David where Scripture leaves him, at rest with his fathers, his body buried in the city he made his own, his son seated on the throne, his words still echoing, his songs still rising, his failures still warning, his repentance still teaching, his covenant still pointing beyond himself. There is also comfort in the way David's story refuses to end in human achievement alone. If the story ended only with victories, we might think strength was the center. If it ended only with failure, we might think sorrow had the final word. But David's life ends with promise. It ends with the kingdom passed on, the covenant remembered, the old king gathered to his fathers, and the word of the Lord still alive beyond him. That is the pattern of grace. God's people live for a time, and then they rest. Their work is real, but it is not ultimate. Their obedience matters, but the promise does not depend on their perfection. The Lord receives faithful service, corrects wandering hearts, forgives the contrite, and carries his own purpose forward when one generation has finished its course. So when you think of David tonight, do not think only of the crown. Think of the harp. Think of the field. Think of the stone in the shepherd's pouch. Think of Jonathan's friendship. Think of Abigail's wise restraint. Think of Nathan standing before a king with truth in his mouth. Think of the old man preparing what he could for a house he would not build with his own hands. A life is not made holy by one shining moment. It is shaped across many returns. Return after fear. Return after success. Return after sin. Return after grief. Return after being corrected. Return after being rescued. Again and again, David returns to the Lord, and maybe that is why his story is so restful at the end. Not because every wound is repaired in the way we might wish, not because every sorrow is explained, but because the final weight does not rest upon David's strength. It rests upon the Lord's faithfulness. If you are listening in the dark with your own unfinished story, that is a mercy worth receiving. You do not need to have ruled well over every part of your life to come back to God. You do not need to understand every consequence before you ask for mercy. You do not need to be impressive in order to be seen. The Lord who saw David in the field sees hidden hearts still. The Lord who heard David in the cave hears quiet prayers still. The Lord who restored David after confession still receives the humble, and the Lord who kept the promise beyond David keeps his promises still. Let that thought become gentle now. Let it loosen whatever has been tight in the chest. Let it make space for rest. So let the story grow quiet now. Let Jerusalem settle in the distance. Let the last light rest on the walls. Let the palace become still. Let the harp fall silent in its place. Let the road from pasture to throne, from cave to covenant, from grief to rest, lie before you as one long testimony that the Lord is patient, holy, faithful, and full of mercy. David walked with God, though not without stumbling. He sang to God, though not without tears. He ruled under God, though not without chastening. And when his life was finished, the promise of God remained. That is David's legacy. Not perfection, promise. Not spotless strength, mercy. not a crown held without trembling, a heart that learned over and over again to return to the Lord. So rest now beneath that remembrance. The Lord who watched a shepherd boy in Bethlehem still watches over every life laid open before him. The Lord who forgave a broken king is still merciful. The Lord who kept covenant then is still faithful now. And if the night has grown deep around you, let it be gentle. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts become quiet as sheep at evening, settled under a shepherd's care. For the God of David neither slumbers nor sleeps. He keeps watch. He remembers mercy. He establishes what he has spoken. And in his care, even tired hearts may rest. This has been the Shepherd's Bible.